My daughter demanded my $3.6 million beach house, looking me dead in the eye and telling me, "You owe me this, Dad." This was just days after I discovered I was not even invited to her wedding. I did not argue with her. I called the orphanage instead. My name is Alton. I am 69 years old. I spent my entire life building bridges across this city, only to watch my own flesh and blood try to burn ours to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The harsh grit of the sandpaper block slid against the custom oak chair in my modest Chicago garage. Wood dust coated my forearms and settled into the deep creases of my palms. Outside, the brutal winter wind rattled the thin metal of the garage door. I pressed my weight into the wood, smoothing out a rough patch on the curved backrest. I built things to last. I always believed a strong foundation could withstand any storm. The sharp chime of my tablet broke the steady rhythm of my work. I wiped my hands on my heavy denim apron and reached for the glowing screen. A notification flashed brightly against the dim light of my cluttered workbench. A distant cousin from Atlanta had tagged me in a new social media post. I tapped the alert with a dust-covered finger. The screen loaded a series of high-resolution images. My breath caught abruptly in my throat. I stared at the bright, vibrant colors of a lavish celebration I knew absolutely nothing about. The glowing screen displayed my daughter Kendra. She wore a custom designer gown that swept across the pristine marble steps of an elite downtown hotel. She clung tightly to the arm of Blake, her new white husband, flashing a dazzling, perfectly rehearsed smile for the professional photographers. The caption beneath the photo read, "Yesterday's perfect fairy tale." I rubbed my eyes, thinking the airborne wood dust had blurred my vision. I checked the date on the post. I checked the tagged location. The wedding had happened less than 24 hours ago, taking place barely 10 miles from my driveway. I scrolled frantically through the digital gallery. I saw Blake's wealthy parents raising crystal champagne flutes in the center of a massive ballroom. I saw groomsmen in tailored tuxedos and bridesmaids in expensive silk dresses laughing on a grand staircase. I saw a massive 5-tier cake draped in golden fondant and a live string quartet playing in the background. I looked for my own face in the crowd. I searched every background shot for a single empty chair bearing my name. There was nothing. I sat down heavily on my wooden stool, the sandpaper block slipping from my grip and clattering onto the concrete floor. For the last 10 years, I paid Kendra's luxury apartment rent without missing a single month. I funded her entire out-of-state college education at a premium university so she could graduate completely debt-free. I bought her first car when she complained about taking the train. I paid for her medical emergencies and her sudden career changes. I gave her every financial advantage a father could possibly provide to ensure her success. Yet, on the most significant day of her life, I was utterly invisible. She had orchestrated an entire wedding booked in an elite venue and legally bound herself to a man she had been dating for 2 years, all while keeping me entirely in the dark. The silence of the garage suddenly felt suffocating. I did not receive a misplaced invitation lost in the mail. I was deliberately excluded. I looked down at my hands. The skin was scarred, permanently calloused and toughened by 40 years of relentless labor. I was a retired civil engineer. I spent 4 decades walking across freezing steel beams and overseeing the pouring of thousands of tons of concrete to build the bridges that connected this sprawling city. I worked brutal double shifts through agonizing winters so Kendra would never have to experience the bitter sting of poverty I knew as a child. I wanted her to walk into any room with her head held high, secure in her place in the world. My reward for a lifetime of backbreaking sacrifice was complete public erasure. She was profoundly ashamed of the rough working-class hands that had built the very foundation of her privileged life. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. The line rang 4 times before she finally answered. Her voice carried a sharp, unmistakable edge of annoyed impatience. "What is it, Dad?" she sighed. The background noise over the receiver was full of clinking silverware, soft jazz music, and polite laughter. I asked her directly about the photos on the screen. I asked her why she stood at an altar and got married without telling me. Kendra did not hesitate or offer a single word of apology. She kept her tone completely flat and clinical, as if we were discussing a minor scheduling conflict. "The wedding was strictly for Blake's high society circle," she stated coldly. She told me a retired black blue-collar worker sitting in the front row would completely ruin the curated aesthetic of the event. She claimed Blake's primary business investors were present, and my appearance would raise highly uncomfortable questions about her background. The blunt cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She erased me from her life to protect a wealthy, manufactured image. Before I could even process the magnitude of the insult, she quickly shifted her tone to strict business. "I actually need to see you," she announced briskly. "I am coming over to your house tomorrow morning to discuss a crucial financial transfer. We have highly important business to handle regarding the estate. Be ready." She ended the call immediately. The harsh dial tone buzzed loudly in my ear. I lowered the phone slowly to the workbench. She decided I was too embarrassing to attend her wedding, but she felt perfectly entitled to demand my money the very next day. The initial grief evaporating from my chest was rapidly replaced by a freezing, highly calculated focus. A predator was coming to my door tomorrow morning. I needed to prepare my defenses. The front door of my Chicago home swung open without a single knock. Kendra walked in with the absolute entitlement of someone who believed she owned the very air she breathed. Blake followed closely behind her. He wore a crisp navy suit that looked completely out of place in my modest living room. He scanned the room with a subtle sneer before he approached my favorite armchair. He actually stopped to brush invisible dust off the fabric before lowering himself onto the cushion. Neither of them offered a single word of greeting. Neither of them mentioned the lavish wedding they had celebrated just 48 hours prior. There were no apologies for excluding me. There were no excuses about lost invitations. They looked at me with the cold expectation of collectors arriving to demand a massive debt. I remained standing near the kitchen island with my arms crossed over my chest. I watched the daughter I had raised from a completely new perspective. She sat perfectly straight on the edge of the sofa, clutching an expensive leather handbag. Her posture was rigid and defensive. She did not look like a glowing newlywed. She looked like a corporate raider preparing for a hostile takeover. Blake adjusted his silk tie and offered me a polished, utterly fake smile. He reeked of expensive cologne and hidden desperation. I did not offer them coffee or water. I waited in absolute silence for them to state their business. The tension in the room grew heavy and suffocating. Kendra finally broke the silence. She reached into her designer bag with a sharp, calculated movement. Kendra pulled out a thick black legal binder and dropped it squarely onto my coffee table. The heavy thud echoed against the hardwood floor. She pushed it toward me with a manicured finger. She commanded me to sit down and sign the documents immediately. She did not ask. She ordered. I looked down at the gold lettering on the binder cover. It contained the deed transfer paperwork for the oceanfront beach house in Martha's Vineyard. The property was currently appraised at $3.6 million. I looked back up at her, waiting for an explanation. Kendra crossed her arms and lifted her chin. She told me I owed her this property as compensation. She claimed that growing up as the daughter of a black civil engineer had put her at a severe social disadvantage. She told me that while I provided her with tuition and rent, I had completely failed to give her the prestigious family background required to survive in Blake's elite world. She actually looked me dead in the eye and said my blue-collar legacy was an embarrassment she had to actively overcome. Transferring the Martha's Vineyard estate to her name would finally balance the scales. It would legitimize her in the eyes of her new high society in-laws. Blake leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He adopted a smooth, persuasive tone, completely ignoring the horrific insult his wife had just delivered. He explained that his tech startup was on the verge of a massive expansion. He stated they needed a high-value physical asset to secure a crucial business loan from a private investment firm. He assured me this was a temporary measure. He promised the property would remain in the family and that their future wealth would multiply tenfold. He spoke with the slippery confidence of a man entirely accustomed to taking things that did not belong to him. He was using corporate buzzwords to mask a blatant robbery. Kendra tapped her foot impatiently against the floorboards. She demanded I stop wasting their valuable time and fetch a pen. She insisted this was the absolute least I could do after failing to provide her with a proper pedigree. The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the air like a foul stench. They had excluded me from their wedding because I was not good enough, yet they demanded my most valuable asset to fund their lavish lifestyle. I asked Blake why his own wealthy family could not provide the collateral for his business loan. His jaw clenched tightly. A brief flash of panic crossed his blue eyes before he masked it with another hollow smile. He claimed his family assets were currently tied up in complex international trusts. He insisted my beach house was the most liquid and accessible option. Kendra snapped at me for daring to question her husband. She told me I was being selfish and stubborn. She reminded me that I was an old man living alone in a simple Chicago suburb. She argued that a retired carpenter had absolutely no use for a multi-million-dollar vacation home. She declared she was simply reallocating dead capital to secure her future. I stared at the black binder resting on the table. My mind drifted back 30 years. My late wife Cora and I had worked brutal double shifts for decades to afford that specific piece of land. Cora had taken extra nursing shifts at the city hospital while I poured concrete in the freezing rain to save every possible dollar. We built the primary structure with our own bare hands during our brief summer vacations. It was never an investment property or a piece of dead capital. It was our sacred retreat. It was the only place where Cora felt entirely free from the crushing weight of the world. She had planted every single rose bush in the front yard. I had carved the wraparound porch where we spent our evenings watching the ocean. That house contained the very soul of our marriage. Kendra was demanding I hand over my wife's legacy so a white con artist could pawn it off for a startup loan. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or throw them out of my home. I simply observed them. Despite Blake's smooth words, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly against his knees. There was a desperate, feverish sweat forming on his brow. He needed this house to survive something much darker than a startup expansion. I slowly nodded my head. I told them I needed a day to thoroughly review the legal language before I signed anything. Kendra smiled triumphantly, clearly believing she had won the battle. She stood up, grabbed Blake by the arm, and practically dragged him out the front door without another word. The moment the lock clicked shut, I picked up the heavy binder and opened the cover. I flipped past the standard transfer agreements directly to the final beneficiary page. My blood turned to ice. Kendra had not just prepared the paperwork, she had already forged my signature on the bottom line. She had officially listed herself as the sole primary beneficiary and notarized the document with a fraudulent stamp. The request for me to sign was nothing but a calculated distraction. The war had officially started. The drive from my suburban home to downtown Chicago took exactly 45 minutes. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck with a renewed sense of absolute clarity. The initial shock of my daughter's betrayal had completely evaporated from my mind, leaving behind a cold and mechanical focus. I navigated the heavy city traffic and pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek glass skyscraper. I rode the elevator to the 50th floor. The polished steel doors opened into the reception area of my private attorney, Gavin Wright. Gavin was a brilliant legal mind who possessed an absolute intolerance for nonsense. I walked straight past his receptionist and pushed open the heavy oak doors to his corner office. Gavin looked up from his dual monitors, surprised by my sudden and unannounced arrival. I did not offer a greeting or an explanation. I simply tossed the heavy black binder directly onto the center of his immaculate mahogany desk. The gold lettering on the cover caught the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the microscopic dust particles dance in the shaft of sunlight. I thought about the sheer entitlement radiating from my daughter's face just an hour prior. She had walked into my home with a forged document and demanded my compliance. She had entirely miscalculated my intelligence. I instructed Gavin to open the binder and look at the final page. He flipped through the thick stack of legal jargon and stopped at the beneficiary signature line. His eyes narrowed instantly. He recognized the crude forgery of my handwriting without me having to say a single word. I told him my daughter and her new husband had just demanded I sign over my entire Martha's Vineyard estate to fund a tech startup. I told him to look into the man she had just married. Gavin did not ask any questions. He pushed his coffee cup aside, cracked his knuckles, and began typing aggressively on his keyboard. He possessed access to private financial databases that could strip away any manufactured social facade in a matter of seconds. I stood by the window and watched the city I had helped build, waiting for the ugly truth to surface. Gavin's keystrokes echoed sharply in the quiet office. 10 minutes passed in complete silence before he let out a low, bitter laugh. He spun his monitor around to face me. The prestigious elite background Kendra had weaponized against me was an absolute fabrication. Blake did not come from generational wealth or high society. His family had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 2 years ago. Their ancestral estate had been foreclosed on by the bank and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Their luxury vehicles were entirely leased and severely past due. The high society guests I had seen in the wedding photos were nothing more than hired extras and desperate social climbers clinging to a dead legacy. But the reality was much darker than simple social climbing. Gavin pulled up a secondary financial report. He had traced Blake's personal footprint through a series of offshore accounts and hidden liabilities. Blake was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of debt. He owed over $2 million to underground loan sharks and unregulated offshore casinos. The tech startup he claimed to be expanding was a completely hollow shell company. It existed solely on paper to launder money and secure fraudulent loans. Kendra had not married a tech billionaire or a high society heir. She had legally bound herself to a desperate parasite. Blake was using my daughter as a convenient disposable tool to extract my wealth and save his own life. The violent loan sharks were closing in on him, and he needed a massive liquid asset to pay them off. He targeted the Martha's Vineyard property because it was fully paid off and worth millions. Blake was a cornered animal wearing a tailored suit. His smooth words in my living room were not the pitch of a confident entrepreneur. They were the desperate pleas of a man terrified of the consequences waiting for him in the shadows. He had found the perfect mark in Kendra. Her desperation to erase her working-class roots made her the easiest target he had ever encountered. Kendra believed she was ascending to the upper echelons of society. In reality, she was walking blindly into a financial slaughterhouse, eagerly dragging my life's work right along with her. She had allowed a white con artist to convince her that her black father was an embarrassment, all while he plotted to steal every single dollar I had earned. The sheer manipulation was staggering. Blake had orchestrated the perfect heist using my daughter's deep-seated insecurities and manufactured shame to turn her into his primary accomplice. They needed me to sign that binder to legitimize the theft. They needed the deed transferred so Blake could immediately leverage the property to pay off his dangerous creditors. Gavin continued digging through the financial records to assess the full extent of the damage. He pulled up a secure portal connecting to my primary banking institution. He needed to verify that my other assets were safe from their fraudulent reach. He clicked on the joint emergency savings account. My chest tightened as I looked at the screen. I had established that specific fund 15 years ago when Kendra was diagnosed with a severe autoimmune condition. I worked grueling weekend overtime, freezing my hands on icy steel girders just to ensure she would never lack the best medical care. I missed holidays and worked through painful injuries to deposit a portion of my paycheck into that account every single month. It was an untouchable safety net designed solely to protect her life. Gavin stared at the balance. The account was completely empty. The ledger revealed a systematic draining of funds over the past 6 months. Kendra had secretly transferred $80,000 in large, untraceable increments. She had stolen the very money I bled to save for her health. Gavin tracked the routing numbers. The stolen $80,000 went directly to luxury event planners, designer boutiques, and premium caterers. My daughter had funded her secret elite wedding using my emergency medical savings. She stole my retirement safety net to pay for the exact same party she explicitly banned me from attending. The ultimate betrayal crystallized in my mind. She had financed her own fake fairy tale with my sweat, and then demanded my house as the finale. I felt a profound shift in my soul. The father who would have sacrificed anything for his little girl died in that exact moment. I looked at the zeros on the bank statement. I looked at the forged signature on the black binder. I was no longer dealing with family. I was dealing with hostile thieves who had breached my walls. I did not shout or punch the wall. My anger condensed into pure, weaponized logic. I leaned forward and placed my calloused hands flat on Gavin's desk. I instructed him to close the investigation immediately. I did not need to see another document. I told Gavin to draft an irrevocable deed of transfer for the Martha's Vineyard estate. I wanted the paperwork finalized, sealed, and ready for my signature within the hour. Blake and Kendra wanted my property. I was going to make absolutely certain they could never touch a single grain of sand on that beach. Alton pulls his heavy diesel truck into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Haven. The imposing red brick structure stands like a fortress on the western edge of Chicago. The architecture is sturdy, unpretentious, and weathered by decades of harsh winters. Alton turns off the ignition and grips the leather steering wheel. The engine ticks loudly as it cools in the crisp morning air. Outside the thick glass windshield, dozens of children chase a worn soccer ball across a patchy green lawn. Their high-pitched laughter cuts through the low mechanical hum of distant highway traffic. Alton watches a young black boy in a scuffed, oversized jacket trip and fall hard onto the dirt. An older girl immediately rushes over, pulls him back to his feet, and forcefully dusts off his shoulders. They resume their game without shedding a single tear. Alton feels a familiar heavy tightness grip his chest. He grabs the thick manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. He steps out of the truck and locks the doors. The crisp wind bites aggressively at his face. He walks up the concrete steps leading to the main entrance. He notes the peeling white paint on the door frames and the slight dangerous sag in the wooden porch beams. This place operates entirely on shoestring budgets and sheer stubborn willpower. He pulls open the heavy steel door and enters the bustling reception area. The scent of industrial pine cleaner and warm oatmeal fills the narrow hallway. A receptionist points him down the corridor toward the administrative wing. Alton does not pause to look at the bulletin boards covered in bright crayon drawings. His mind remains entirely focused on the mission at hand. He walks with the deliberate, measured strides of a man who knows exactly what must be done to balance the scales of justice. He approaches the frosted glass door at the end of the hall. He knocks twice and pushes the door open. Director Miriam sits behind a cluttered metal desk stacked impossibly high with manila folders and red-lined budget reports. She is a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s wearing a practical gray cardigan over a simple blouse. Her graying hair is pulled back tightly into a severe bun. She looks up from her glowing computer screen, genuinely surprised by the sudden intrusion into her office. Alton steps forward and stands directly in front of her desk. He does not offer polite pleasantries. He does not engage in empty small talk about the weather or the facility. He takes the thick manila envelope and slides it forcefully across the scratched surface of her desk. The heavy paper stops just inches from her keyboard. Miriam looks down at the envelope and then back up at Alton. She asks him directly what this is about. Alton instructs her to open the seal. Miriam breaks the paper flap and pulls out the stack of dense legal documents drafted by Gavin Wright just hours prior. Her eyes scan the bold, capitalized print at the very top of the first page. She reads the words, "Irrevocable deed of transfer and Martha's Vineyard estate." She looks up her face, registering profound, unfiltered shock. She asks Alton if he actually understands the massive financial magnitude of what he is placing on her desk. Alton states clearly that he is signing over the complete and total ownership of his $3.6 million oceanfront property to the Haven. He explains the transfer is backed by an ironclad trust entirely immune to external legal challenges. The property will belong exclusively to the orphanage, completely free of any liens, mortgages, or financial encumbrances. Miriam drops the documents onto her desk. She stammers, explaining that their entire annual operating budget is barely $500,000. She tells Alton a donation of this immense size is utterly unprecedented in the history of their organization. She asks him why a wealthy man is giving away a pristine luxury estate instead of leaving it to his immediate family. Alton keeps his posture completely rigid. He tells her his biological family has already taken everything they are owed. He explains that the people he shares blood with view his hard-earned assets as a personal bank account to fund their elite social fantasies. He states he will not allow a gang of financial parasites to leverage his life's work to pay off gambling debts to underground loan sharks. He wants the house to serve a genuine life-saving purpose. He wants it to belong to children who actually understand the true value of a safe harbor. Miriam traces her finger over the prestigious property address printed on the deed. She asks Alton what makes this specific house so important to him. Alton looks past her, focusing on the framed photos of smiling foster children lining her office wall. He tells her about his late wife, Cora. Cora did not grow up in a manicured suburban home with heated pools, private tutors, and endless entitlement. She spent her entire childhood bouncing violently between overcrowded foster homes and severely underfunded state facilities. She knew exactly what it meant to carry all her worldly belongings in a single black trash bag. When Alton and Cora finally saved enough money to purchase the Martha's Vineyard lot, Cora did not view it as a high society status symbol. She viewed it as the ultimate sanctuary. They spent every single summer repairing the roof, painting the walls, and laying the hardwood floors together. Cora would sit on the wraparound porch and watch the ocean waves crash against the shore. She constantly told Alton that one day she wanted to fill the empty rooms with children who had nowhere else to go. She wanted to give them one perfect summer away from the concrete, the noise, and the trauma of the city. She wanted to prove to them that they absolutely deserved to experience beauty. Cora died before she could turn that beautiful vision into a physical reality. Alton kept the house pristine for years, foolishly hoping Kendra would eventually mature and share her mother's compassionate vision. Instead, Kendra demanded the property to impress a bankrupt white con artist and his fake high society friends. She spit on her mother's legacy to buy her way into a circle of liars. Alton states he is completely done waiting for a selfish daughter to suddenly develop a conscience. He is stepping up to fulfill his wife's dying vow right now. The beach house will become the permanent summer retreat Cora always dreamed of creating. Miriam listens in absolute silence. The immense weight of his conviction fills the small administrative office. She warns him that a real estate transfer of this massive magnitude will not go unnoticed by the public or the state. She states his daughter and her new husband will inevitably discover the high-value asset is gone. She cautions Alton that angry, desperate relatives will undoubtedly attempt to drag the haven into a brutal, drawn-out legal battle to reclaim the estate. Alton does not flinch or break eye contact. He pulls a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket. He assures Miriam that Gavin Wright has constructed an impenetrable legal fortress around the trust. Any lawsuit filed by his daughter will be dismissed by a federal judge instantly. Alton flips to the final page of the deed and signs his name with a steady, forceful hand. He pushes the finalized, legally binding document back across the desk. He issues one final, strictly non-negotiable condition. Miriam must keep this transfer absolutely confidential for exactly 7 days. She must not register the public announcement or inform the board of directors until next Saturday. He needs Blake to feel completely secure in his fraudulent ownership. He needs the loan sharks to arrive at the property expecting a massive payout. Miriam nods in agreement and secures the heavy deed inside her steel wall safe. Alton turns and walks out of the office. The legal trap is officially set. The drive back to my Chicago home was silent and freezing. I parked my heavy diesel truck in the driveway and walked up the concrete front steps. The bitter winter air bit aggressively through my thick canvas coat. Inside the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a warm home waiting for a beloved daughter to return. It was a sterile staging ground for a necessary war. I walked directly into the kitchen and poured myself a mug of bitter black coffee. I leaned against the granite countertop and stared at the glowing digital clock on the stove. The legal trap was securely locked inside Miriam's steel safe at the orphanage, but the bait still needed to be completely swallowed by the predators. I picked up my phone and dialed Kendra's number. I needed to play the role of the defeated, compliant old man to absolute perfection. I cleared my throat and forcefully injected a warm, gentle tone into my voice as the line connected. Kendra answered with a sharp, highly irritated greeting. I did not let her aggressive impatience deter me. I told her I had spent the entire morning thoroughly reviewing the Martha's Vineyard deed transfer paperwork with my private attorney. I swallowed my disgust and layered pure compliance into every single syllable. I assured her that the documents looked perfectly standard and that the property transfer process was moving forward smoothly. I told her the legal review was just a necessary formality and that I understood exactly why Blake needed the massive asset for his tech startup. I played the part of the naive, accommodating, broken father flawlessly. Kendra let out a piercing shriek of pure delight. The icy corporate tone she had weaponized in my living room instantly vanished. It was rapidly replaced by the manic, breathless excitement of a lottery winner. She did not offer a single word of gratitude. She did not thank me for willingly handing over a $3.6 million estate. She immediately launched into a frantic, arrogant monologue about her upcoming social plans. She loudly announced that she and Blake were hosting a massive, lavish post-wedding and housewarming celebration at the beach house this coming Saturday. She bragged about the exclusive private catering company they had hired and the wooden crates of vintage champagne they had ordered. This was not a simple family gathering to celebrate a new marriage. She explicitly stated she was inviting Blake's entire network of high-profile investors, elite business partners, and private creditors. She intended to use my life's work as a grand, theatrical stage to flaunt her newly acquired wealth. She wanted to solidify Blake's fraudulent financial standing in front of the exact loan sharks he owed $2 million to. She was throwing a spectacular banquet for parasites using my stolen property as the main course. I listened quietly as she eagerly listed the prominent names and luxury sports cars that would soon fill my driveway. Then the inevitable blow arrived. Her voice dropped back into a cold, commanding register. She bluntly told me I was absolutely forbidden from attending the celebration. She stated that the guest list was strictly curated for high-net-worth individuals and elite socialites. She actually told me that my faded work boots, my calloused hands, and my blue-collar vocabulary would be a catastrophic embarrassment to her new sophisticated brand. She refused to let my working-class presence contaminate her flawless debut into the upper echelons of society. She ordered me to stay in Chicago and stay completely out of her way. The cruelty was raw, unfiltered, and entirely unapologetic. She was gleefully claiming the massive fortune I had built with my bare hands while simultaneously banishing me to the shadows because I was not elite enough to stand on the very hardwood floors I had personally installed. She demanded my wealth but completely rejected my humanity. I held the phone tightly against my ear, letting her harsh, demanding insults wash over me in complete silence. My mind pulled up a vivid memory from 24 years ago. I remembered standing on the cracked concrete sidewalk outside the neighborhood elementary school. I was holding Kendra's tiny hand on her very first day of kindergarten. She had been absolutely terrified of the large brick building and the chaotic crowds of loud children. She squeezed my rough fingers so tightly, looking up at me with wide, trusting, innocent eyes. I knelt down on the cold concrete, adjusted her small pink backpack, and promised her I would always be her unbreakable shield against the harsh world. I kept that sacred promise for decades. I shielded her from poverty, from crushing debt, and from every conceivable hardship. But the innocent, frightened child I comforted on that sidewalk was completely gone. She had died a long time ago. She had been entirely replaced by a hollow, calculating monster consumed by uncontrollable greed and manufactured vanity. The daughter I lovingly raised was officially dead to me. I did not argue with her arrogant command. I kept my voice perfectly even and entirely devoid of emotion. I told her I understood completely. I agreed to stay far away from Martha's Vineyard and promised not to ruin her perfect high society night. Kendra offered a smug, dismissive farewell and ended the call abruptly. I lowered the phone and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste matched the freezing resolve settling permanently in my chest. She wanted a spectacular high society spectacle. She wanted to gather all of Blake's desperate creditors and fake billionaire friends under one roof to witness her ultimate triumph. I immediately pulled up my contacts and dialed Gavin Wright. The phone barely rang once before my attorney answered. I gave him a single explicit instruction. The ultimate financial slaughter was going to take place squarely in the middle of Kendra's lavish celebration. The Friday afternoon sun cast long, bitter shadows across the frozen Massachusetts coastline. I drove my heavy diesel truck onto the familiar gravel driveway of the Martha's Vineyard estate, keeping the engine at a low, steady idle. The biting Atlantic wind whipped against the windshield, carrying the sharp scent of salt and imminent snow. I did not come here to linger. I did not come here to mourn the loss of my daughter or the impending loss of this house. I came solely to retrieve a single framed portrait of Cora that still hung above the stone fireplace in the main living room. That photograph belonged exclusively to me, and I absolutely refused to let it become collateral damage in the financial slaughter scheduled for tomorrow evening. I parked my truck deep near the tree line, intentionally keeping the vehicle hidden from the main road and the sweeping driveway. The grand cedar-shingled house stood proudly against the gray winter sky, looking exactly as Cora and I had built it decades ago. The polished glass windows reflected the restless, churning ocean. I walked toward the side entrance, my heavy work boots crunching softly against the frosted grass. The coastal air was supposed to be completely silent. The property was supposed to be empty until the luxury caterers arrived on Saturday morning. Instead, the aggressive mechanical roar of an industrial backhoe shattered the peaceful environment. I froze instantly. I stepped behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree, letting the heavy rumbling vibrate through the soles of my boots. I peered around the rough bark and stared at the front yard. A massive yellow excavator was parked directly on the pristine front lawn. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline pump through my veins. The invasion had already begun. I slipped through the side door and stepped quietly into the unlit mudroom. I moved through the shadows of the hallway with the practiced silence of a man who knows the creak of every single floorboard in the structure. The heavy oak front door stood wide open, letting the freezing ocean wind rip violently through the grand foyer. Blake stood squarely on the front porch, wearing an expensive camel hair overcoat and holding a steaming cup of coffee. He was aggressively shouting orders at a three-man demolition crew standing in the dirt. He pointed a gloved finger directly at Cora's vintage rose garden. That garden was a sprawling, vibrant masterpiece that took my wife 20 years to cultivate from seeds she had carried from her childhood foster home. Blake commanded the foreman to tear the entire garden up from the roots immediately. He loudly complained that the dormant bushes were a hideous eyesore and demanded the ground be perfectly leveled by sunset to make room for a custom infinity pool. The rugged foreman hesitated, pointing out that digging deeply into the frozen earth would require heavy excavation equipment and completely destroy the underlying irrigation system I had installed. Blake sneered with absolute disgust. He told the man he was paying him to dig, not to offer uninvited opinions. The heavy backhoe lurched forward, its jagged steel teeth sinking violently into the frozen soil. The massive treads crushed the delicate rose bushes, snapping the dormant branches like brittle bones. The deep roots Cora had tenderly nurtured with her own hands were ripped violently from the earth and tossed aside like worthless garbage. I gripped the wooden frame of the hallway doorway so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I watched my wife's living legacy get shredded into dirt. Blake turned around and marched back onto the porch to escape the biting winter wind. He stomped his expensive leather boots against the threshold to forcefully shake off the mud. His boot caught the edge of the handcrafted oak bench resting near the front door. He kicked the furniture violently, leaving a deep, ugly scuff mark across the polished wood. He muttered under his breath, complaining to the empty foyer about the cheap, hideous trash cluttering up his new luxury property. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, completely oblivious to the man standing just 15 feet away in the shadows of the hallway. He was standing in my house, actively destroying my wife's legacy and violently kicking the very wood I had shaped with my own blood and sweat. I stared at the deep scuff mark his leather boot had left on the oak bench. I built that specific bench entirely by hand to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary. Every single piece of furniture in this house was custom carved to commemorate a massive milestone in our marriage. The solid mahogany dining room table marked our 20th anniversary. The heavy cedar bed frame marked our 30th. I spent countless hours at my workbench, selecting the right wood, meticulously sanding the grain and polishing the surfaces until they felt like glass. Each piece held a specific beautiful memory. Each piece represented a quiet conversation, a shared moment of absolute peace, and a testament to our survival. I poured my soul into the timber to give Cora the permanent stability she had been brutally denied her entire life. Blake looked at those irreplaceable monuments of devotion and saw absolutely nothing but cheap trash to be discarded. He possessed no concept of earning value through hard work or preserving history. He only knew how to consume and destroy what others had painstakingly built. The sudden sharp ring of Blake's cell phone echoed loudly through the cavernous foyer. He answered the call instantly. His arrogant, commanding posture completely collapsed the very second he heard the voice on the other end of the line. He hunched his shoulders and backed into the darkest corner of the porch, nervously glancing around the empty yard like a hunted animal. His smooth, confident tone was instantly replaced by a frantic, trembling whisper. I slid my right hand into my heavy jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the audio recording application. I held the device completely steady in the darkness. Blake desperately begged the caller for exactly 3 more days of patience. He frantically promised the $2 million debt would be settled in full on Monday morning. He explicitly stated that the Martha's Vineyard deed was entirely in his legal control, and he was transferring the multi-million-dollar asset directly to their offshore holding company the exact moment the banks opened. He swore on his own life that the money was an absolute guarantee. The man on the other end of the line ended the call without another word. Blake leaned heavily against the cedar wall, taking shaky, panicked breaths. He was completely terrified. I stopped the recording and saved the audio file directly to a secure cloud server linked to Gavin Wright. I stepped backward, navigating the hallway blindly until I reached the side door. I slipped out into the freezing wind and walked back to my truck, completely unseen. The explosive was perfectly primed. Saturday evening descended upon the Massachusetts coastline, but the Martha's Vineyard estate was completely immune to the creeping winter darkness. The grand house blazed brilliantly with hundreds of crystal lights strung across the cedar-shingled exterior and the wraparound porch. The property had been transformed into a glowing beacon of manufactured wealth. A long line of rented luxury sports cars and sleek black sedans clogged the winding gravel driveway. Private valets in crisp white jackets rushed back and forth, eager to accommodate the arriving guests. The rhythmic thump of a live bass and the smooth melodies of a jazz band drifted through the freezing ocean breeze, competing with the sound of the crashing waves. Elite socialites, wealthy investors, and dangerous creditors mingled freely on the front lawn. Women wrapped in designer furs clinked crystal champagne flutes with men wearing tailored Italian suits. The atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and the loud, arrogant chatter of people desperate to prove their financial dominance. Kendra had orchestrated a spectacular illusion. She had successfully masked a hollow bankrupt marriage behind a curtain of stolen money and stolen property. The estate radiated an aura of untouchable prestige. I stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the lavish spectacle unfold on my own property. The festive lights reflected off the cold Atlantic water, creating a picture-perfect backdrop for the absolute destruction that was about to occur. I did not wear a tailored tuxedo or a designer overcoat. I wore the exact same faded gray canvas work jacket and scuffed steel-toed boots I had worn on construction sites for 4 decades. I zipped my jacket up against the biting cold and began my slow, steady walk down the gravel driveway toward the glaring lights of the Parasites banquet. I stepped confidently through the wrought iron front gates, my heavy boots crunching loudly against the gravel. A towering private security guard in a dark suit immediately stepped directly into my path. He raised a massive hand and ordered me to halt. He looked me up and down, his eyes locking onto my faded work jacket with clear disdain. He informed me that the catering and maintenance entrance was located around the back of the property. He assumed I was a late-arriving janitor hired to clean up the garbage. Before I could correct his arrogant assumption, a sharp gasp cut through the polite chatter of the nearby guests. Kendra stood at the top of the terrace steps. She was dressed in a shimmering silver evening gown, holding a glass of champagne. Her face drained of all color the exact second her eyes locked onto my gray jacket. The fake aristocratic smile she had been flashing to her guests instantly vanished. Her features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her crystal flute onto a passing waiter's tray and practically sprinted down the terrace stairs. She grabbed me roughly by the forearm, her manicured nails digging painfully through the thick canvas of my coat. She did not offer a greeting. She hissed through gritted teeth, demanding to know what I was doing on her property. She practically dragged me away from the glowing lights of the main entrance and yanked me violently through the heavy side door. We stumbled into the chaotic heat of the catering kitchen. A dozen hired chefs and servers frantically chopped vegetables and plated appetizers around us. Kendra shoved me into a narrow pantry alcove completely out of sight from the main hallway. She unleashed a vicious whispered tirade. She demanded to know why I had defied her explicit orders to stay in Chicago. She pointed a trembling finger at my work boots, calling my appearance a deliberate, malicious attempt to sabotage her social standing. She told me Blake was currently in the living room entertaining men who managed billion-dollar hedge funds. She stated that if any of those powerful investors saw a dirty blue-collar laborer claiming to be her father, Blake's massive business loan would be instantly denied. She accused me of being selfish, jealous, and entirely oblivious to the delicate social game she was playing. She commanded me to remain absolutely silent. She ordered me to stay permanently hidden among the hired catering staff until the party was completely over. She explicitly threatened that if I took a single step into the main house and contaminated her perfect night with my working-class presence, she would cut me out of her life permanently. She told me I was a relic of a pathetic past she was desperately trying to erase. She demanded I show some basic gratitude for the life she was building and learn to accept my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. I did not react to her vicious threats. My eyes slowly drifted away from her furious face and scanned the chaotic catering kitchen. I looked directly at the pristine white marble countertops where the hired chefs were furiously preparing expensive hors d'oeuvres. I remembered exactly what it took to put those heavy stones into place. 10 years ago, I secretly drove a rented flatbed truck to a specialty quarry 3 states away. I spent a massive portion of my savings to secure those exact flawless slabs of Italian marble to surprise Cora for our 25th anniversary. I spent 4 grueling days lifting the crushing weight with a mechanical hoist, meticulously leveling the custom cabinets and sealing the stone with my own 2 hands. I endured deep cuts and severely bruised ribs just to see the radiant, joyful smile light up my wife's face when she finally saw her dream kitchen realized. That marble represented a solid decade of pure, unyielding devotion. Kendra was currently using the very stone I bled over as a dumping ground for her empty champagne glasses, treating the physical manifestation of my enduring love as nothing more than a convenient catering prop for her fake life. Kendra snapped her fingers directly in front of my face, demanding my immediate compliance. She told me to shrink into the background and act like a silent ghost until the last guest departed. She spun around, smoothed out the shimmering fabric of her expensive silver gown, and marched confidently back out into the dazzling lights of the party to rejoin her wealthy predators. I stood completely alone in the shadows of the pantry. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or attempt to follow her into the grand foyer to cause a scene. I simply offered a silent nod to the empty doorway. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my canvas jacket and pulled out my cell phone. The digital screen illuminated my calloused thumb in the dim light of the alcove. I opened my secure messaging application and selected Gavin Wright's contact name. I did not need to write a lengthy explanation or ask for a status update on the legal filings. I typed 2 simple, definitive words into the text box. Execute now. I hit send and slid the phone back into my pocket. I leaned against the cold wall and waited for the absolute destruction of Kendra's manufactured world to begin. The sharp, clear ring of a silver spoon tapping against crystal cut through the low thrum of the live jazz band. The lively chatter of the elite crowd immediately began to quiet down. Blake stood halfway up the grand cedar staircase holding a flute of vintage champagne high in the air. The massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling cast a warm golden glow over his tailored navy tuxedo. He looked down at the sea of guests filling my living room. Women in shimmering designer gowns and men wearing bespoke Italian suits turned their attention toward the staircase. Waiters in crisp white shirts retreated to the edges of the room, standing completely still with their silver trays held flat against their sides. The string quartet smoothly faded into silence, leaving only the sound of the freezing Atlantic wind rattling against the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood in the dark, narrow service corridor just behind the catering kitchen. I positioned myself completely out of sight, but kept a clear view of the grand foyer through the slatted wooden service window. The smell of expensive roasted meats and imported truffles drifted heavily through the air. Dozens of luxury cars remained parked shoulder to shoulder on the gravel driveway outside. Inside, the sheer concentration of manufactured wealth was suffocating. I watched the crowd gather closely around the base of the staircase, their eyes fixed upward with rapt attention. Kendra glided up the steps to join her new husband. Her silver gown caught the chandelier light, making her look like a pristine, untouchable statue. She placed a manicured hand delicately on Blake's shoulder and offered the crowd a practiced, radiant smile. The stage was perfectly set for their grand illusion. Blake cleared his throat and projected his voice across the massive room with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. He welcomed his esteemed guests, thanking them profusely for traveling all the way to the Massachusetts coast in the dead of winter. He raised his glass to Kendra, calling her the absolute light of his life and his perfect partner in building their vast new empire. The wealthy crowd offered a polite, muted round of applause. Then Blake shifted his tone to something much more sinister and arrogant. He spread his arms wide, gesturing to the soaring vaulted ceilings, the hand-carved mahogany beams, and the sprawling stone fireplace. He loudly declared that this magnificent estate was a generational family asset. He claimed the property had been in his private portfolio for years, describing it as a sacred retreat meant strictly for high society gatherings and elite business expansions. He explicitly told the crowd that the house was the physical manifestation of his incredible financial foresight and his family's long-standing pedigree. He completely erased my entire existence, my endless labor, and my absolute ownership of the property in a single confident sentence. I watched the crowd carefully through the narrow wooden slats of the service window. My eyes locked onto a distinct group of men standing near the back of the foyer. They did not wear tuxedos. They wore dark, heavy overcoats and stood with stiff, aggressive postures. These were not tech investors or college friends. These were the underground loan sharks Gavin had warned me about. They stared at the cedar walls and the imported marble floors with cold, calculating eyes. When Blake proudly announced that the estate was fully under his legal control and ready to be leveraged for their upcoming business ventures, the men in the dark coats nodded slowly. Their faces twisted into expressions of pure, greedy satisfaction. They were actively appraising the very walls around them, mentally dividing up my property to cover Blake's massive, hidden $2 million gambling debt. Kendra stood proudly beside him on the staircase, completely oblivious to the dangerous predators circling her living room. She leaned her head against Blake's shoulder, playing the flawless role of the triumphant heiress. She soaked in the admiring gazes of the legitimate guests and the polite murmurs of approval. She believed she had finally shed her working-class roots and ascended to the peak of the social hierarchy. She stood on the very steps I had cut, sanded, and installed, allowing a desperate con artist to publicly steal the credit for my entire life's work. The sheer arrogance radiating from the staircase was absolutely sickening. They were auctioning off my soul to a room full of criminals while smiling for the cameras. My grip tightened around the wooden ledge of the service window. I looked down at the immaculate wide-plank hardwood floors stretching across the grand foyer. I remembered the exact winter I purchased that lumber. The Chicago temperatures had dropped well below zero for 3 consecutive weeks. I worked brutal back-to-back night shifts at an industrial chemical plant on the edge of the city to secure the extra overtime pay. I endured severe chemical burns on my forearms and breathed in toxic exhaust fumes for 14 hours a day just to afford the premium materials Cora deserved. I sacrificed my own physical health so my family could walk on solid oak instead of cheap laminate. I drove the heavy lumber all the way to the coast and spent 2 entire summers perfectly aligning every single board by hand. Every inch of this house was paid for entirely with my blood, my pain, and my unyielding dedication to my family. Now, a room full of arrogant frauds and violent criminals stood on my literal sweat, claiming it as their own rightful prize. Blake raised his champagne flute one final time, proposing a loud toast to their limitless future and their undeniable success. The crowd raised their glasses in unison. Before a single drop of champagne could touch their lips, a blinding flash of high-beam headlights swept aggressively across the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy rhythmic thump of the jazz band was instantly shattered by the deafening aggressive wail of approaching sirens. The piercing sound echoed violently off the crashing ocean waves and the cedar shingles of the estate. Brilliant flashes of blue and red emergency lights began painting the walls of the grand foyer, strobing frantically through the glass doors. The polite, sophisticated chatter of the party immediately died. Complete silence fell over the room, replaced only by the roar of heavy vehicle engines tearing up the gravel driveway. The elite guests froze in place, lowering their crystal glasses in sheer confusion. The loan sharks standing in the back of the room immediately stiffened their hands, dropping toward their coat pockets. A cold, sudden panic rapidly rippled through the high society crowd as heavy footsteps marched forcefully up the front porch steps. The reckoning had officially arrived. The heavy oak front doors of the Martha's Vineyard estate swing open with a violent crash. The freezing Atlantic wind immediately rushes into the grand foyer, extinguishing the decorative candles and chilling the aggressively warm, perfumed air. Gavin Wright steps over the threshold with the absolute uncompromising authority of a man executing a perfect legal strike. He is flanked by Director Miriam, who stands tall and resolute in her practical gray wool coat, clutching a thick leather briefcase tightly against her chest. 4 fully uniformed Massachusetts state police officers fan out behind them, their heavy black boots thudding rhythmically against the pristine hardwood floors. The festive jazz music dies instantly as a terrified catering waiter accidentally unplugs the sound system. The deafening silence in the room is broken only by the crackle of police radios and the low hum of the luxury sports cars idling in the driveway. The high society guests and dangerous creditors freeze in a state of absolute shock. Women in shimmering designer gowns clutch their diamond necklaces. Men in bespoke Italian suits instinctively step back, pulling away from the center of the room to distance themselves from the sudden law enforcement presence. The flashing red and blue emergency lights strobe through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting harsh, alternating shadows across the panicked faces of the elite crowd. Gavin does not pause to survey the lavish decorations or the overflowing champagne towers. He marches directly toward the base of the grand cedar staircase where the fake lords of the manor are currently standing. He moves with a calculated, predatory grace, completely unbothered by the sheer concentration of wealth and power surrounding him. The trap has been perfectly sprung, and the steel jaws are snapping shut. Blake recovers from his initial shock and descends the cedar staircase with reckless, furious momentum. His face flushes a deep, angry crimson against the crisp white collar of his tailored tuxedo. He charges directly at the line of uniformed officers, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding to know who authorized this catastrophic invasion of his private property. He points a trembling finger at Gavin Wright and aggressively orders the intruders to leave his generational estate immediately. He threatens massive lawsuits and loudly claims personal connections to the governor. Gavin does not flinch. He stands his ground like a stone pillar, allowing Blake to exhaust his pathetic, frantic tirade. When Blake finally pauses to draw a ragged breath, Gavin reaches into his tailored jacket and withdraws a thick legal folder. He raises the document high in the air, ensuring the bright red official state registry stamps are clearly visible to every single person in the grand foyer. Gavin's voice echoes off the vaulted ceilings with cold surgical precision. He announces to the entire room that Blake possesses absolutely zero legal authority over the premises. He loudly declares that this $3.6 million estate has belonged exclusively to the Haven Orphanage for the past 5 consecutive days. He explains that Alton executed an irrevocable deed of transfer backed by an impenetrable federal trust, making the property entirely immune to any external claims, liens, or marital assets. The heavy silence in the room thickens as Gavin systematically dismantles Blake's entire reality. He states that every single piece of paper Blake claims to hold, including the forged asset declarations and the fraudulent collateral agreements, is completely and permanently void. The tech startup, the promised leverage, and the generational wealth are nothing but a massive, desperate illusion. Kendra completely collapses against the mahogany banister, her manicured hands covering her mouth in sheer, unfiltered horror as the truth registers. Blake's arrogant posture crumbles instantly. He stammers wildly, accusing Gavin of orchestrating an elaborate scam, insisting that the house is legally his through his recent marriage. Director Miriam steps forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Gavin. She opens her briefcase and produces the original certified copy of the irrevocable deed. She coldly informs Blake that any damage done to the property, including the violently uprooted rose garden, will result in immediate civil litigation against him personally. Blake reaches out desperately, trying to snatch the document from her hands, but a police officer instantly steps between them, resting a heavy hand on his utility belt. The officer loudly instructs Blake to step back, warning him that any further aggression will result in immediate detainment. Gavin issues a loud, uncompromising order to the assembled guests. He informs them that the current gathering constitutes criminal trespassing on private charity property. He gives the elite crowd exactly 10 minutes to clear the premises entirely before the police officers begin making mass arrests. The definitive, unyielding tone of his voice leaves absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. A frantic, chaotic wave of whispers erupts across the grand foyer. The high society guests immediately turn on their hosts. The flawless illusion of Blake's prestigious generational wealth evaporates instantly, exposing him as a desperate, bankrupt fraud. The elite investors he had spent months aggressively courting now look at him with pure disgust, rapidly pulling out their phones to cancel pending deals and sever all professional ties. Kendra watches her meticulously curated social standing disintegrate into dust. These wealthy socialites now realize they are standing on hardwood floors paid for entirely by the literal blood and chemical burns of a working-class father from Chicago. They recognize that the pristine marble countertops and the custom cedar beams were not inherited from a vast family fortune, but forged through decades of double shifts in the freezing Midwest winters. The tragic, unyielding reality of Alton's massive sacrifice violently eclipses Kendra's shallow, manufactured narrative. The pristine coastal sanctuary they tried to steal is legally untouchable. The guests scramble toward the coat check, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of Blake's exposed lies. While the legitimate guests push their way toward the heavy oak doors, the men in the dark overcoats do not move toward the exit. Blake's underground creditors deliberately step forward, forming a tight, inescapable circle around the base of the cedar staircase. Their cold, predatory eyes lock onto Blake with lethal intent. The $3.6 million asset guaranteeing their $2 million in illegal gambling debts has just vanished into thin air. Blake realizes he is entirely trapped. The blood drains completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying pale. He looks at the merciless loan sharks blocking his path and knows his life is in immediate severe danger. Absolute panic overtakes his logic. He turns wildly toward the catering kitchen corridor, searching the shadows. He screams at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure terror. He begs his father-in-law to come out and fix this catastrophic mistake. He demands Alton emerge from the darkness and sign whatever papers are necessary to save him from the violent men closing in. Blake's terrified scream echoes off the vaulted cedar ceiling, hanging in the dead, frigid air of the grand foyer. The chaotic frenzy of the room briefly stalls as the heavy swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen push open. I step out from the shadows and enter the glaring crystal light of the main hall. I am still wearing my faded gray canvas work jacket and my scuffed steel-toed boots. I look entirely out of place among the fleeing elite socialites and the furious dark-coated loan sharks. I am carrying a massive polished silver catering tray in my calloused hands. I do not cower or rush to my son-in-law's aid. I walk with the deliberate, heavy, measured strides of a man who has finally finished building a flawless, inescapable structure. The sea of panicked guests parts for me, instinctively sensing the unyielding weight of my presence. The uniformed police officers watch me closely, keeping their hands resting on their duty belts, but Gavin Wright offers a subtle, respectful nod, officially granting me the floor. I bypass Blake entirely. I ignore the cold sweat pouring down his pale face and his desperate, pleading gestures. I march straight toward the massive mahogany dining table sitting in the center of the adjacent room. I raise the heavy silver tray high above my head and bring it down onto the polished wood with a deafening, violent crash. The crystal champagne flutes surrounding the table rattle dangerously against the impact. The sudden explosive noise acts like a gunshot, instantly silencing the remaining whispers in the room. Every single eye locks onto the working-class father standing at the center of the ruined high society banquet. I stand perfectly straight, my broad shoulders squared against the open hostility of my own daughter. I have emerged exactly as Blake requested, but I have absolutely no intention of offering salvation. Kendra breaks away from the base of the staircase. Her face is pale with a toxic, volatile mixture of severe embarrassment and raw, unfiltered fury. She lunges aggressively across the hardwood floor toward me. Her shimmering silver evening gown catches on a discarded mahogany chair, but she rips the expensive fabric free without caring about the damage. She stops mere inches from my chest and points a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. She completely ignores the armed police officers and the extremely dangerous creditors standing just a few feet away. She demands that I order my lawyer to immediately reverse the charitable donation. She commands me to tear up the orphanage deed and sign the property over to Blake right this second before the remaining investors leave and her social standing is permanently destroyed. She actually claims I am legally obligated to protect her new marriage and fix her husband's financial mistakes. I do not raise my voice to match her hysterical, piercing shrieking. I reach into the deep inside pocket of my faded canvas coat. I do not pull out a silver pen or a new legal contract. I withdraw a thick, meticulously organized stack of official bank statements. I slam the heavy stack of papers down onto the silver catering tray. I look directly at the lingering high society guests and the elite business partners who have paused near the exit. I raise my voice, projecting cold, undeniable facts across the quiet room so every single person can hear me. I begin to read the transaction history aloud. I detail exactly how my daughter funded this lavish coastal wedding. I read the specific dates and the exact dollar amounts Kendra systematically drained from my private medical emergency fund. I expose the $3,000 she stole to pay for her imported floral arrangements. I loudly recite the transfer numbers for the vintage champagne currently sitting in their crystal glasses. I name the exact fraudulent shell accounts she created to bypass my security alerts. I list the $8,000 she fraudulently wired to a private caterer while I was hospitalized fighting to recover from a severe respiratory infection last winter. I lay bare the absolute pathetic reality of her wealth. She did not marry into a massive tech fortune, and she did not build a successful empire. She simply robbed her aging father blind to buy her way into a circle of wealthy strangers. The facts hit the room like physical blows. Kendra gasps and tries to snatch the bank statements off the silver tray, but I easily block her wrist with a firm, unyielding grip. I force her to stand there and listen as her entire fabricated identity is brutally dismantled in front of the exact people she spent months desperately trying to impress. I drop the final page of the bank statement onto the tray and look deeply into Kendra's panicked, welling eyes. I do not offer a single ounce of paternal warmth. I remind her of the brutal winter of 1998. I remind her of the 3 consecutive weeks I spent waist-deep in freezing toxic mud repairing ruptured municipal sewage lines on the south side of Chicago. I remind her of how she cried when she thought she would not have the best dress on the stage, and how I worked an additional 40 hours that week so she could wear a crown. I broke 2 fingers and contracted severe pneumonia just to earn the extra overtime pay required to buy her the custom silk dress she demanded for her very first childhood beauty pageant. I spent my entire adult life absorbing extreme physical suffering to ensure she never had to experience a single moment of discomfort. I shielded her from the ugly realities of survival and gave her absolutely everything a father could possibly give. I state with absolute clarity that she repaid decades of my literal blood and sweat with calculated theft and public humiliation. She viewed my unconditional sacrifice as nothing more than a convenient weakness to be aggressively exploited for her own shallow vanity. The remaining elite guests look at Kendra with profound, unconcealed revulsion. The final fragments of her high society facade shatter entirely into dust right before her eyes. The wealthy socialites pull their expensive designer coats tightly around their shoulders and quickly exit the front doors, absolutely refusing to share the same air as a common thief. With the legitimate investors completely gone, the massive room belongs solely to the authorities and the predators. The heavy dark circle of loan sharks tightly closes the physical distance around Blake. The violent men finally realize that the brilliant tech genius they loaned $2 million to is actually a broke, desperate con artist with absolutely zero collateral to his name. The leader of the underground syndicate cracks his knuckles, his expression shifting from greedy anticipation to murderous rage. The realization of his impending doom washes over Blake's pale face. He takes a trembling step backward, bumping hard into the mahogany banister. He turns wildly, his terrified eyes darting across the grand foyer, searching frantically for any possible physical escape route. The state police officers move in unison to block the front doors while the ruthless creditors aggressively cut off the rear hallway. The trap has snapped permanently shut, leaving him absolutely nowhere to run. Blake's eyes dart wildly across the grand foyer, calculating the rapidly shrinking distance between himself and the advancing syndicate enforcers. He realizes the front doors are entirely blocked by Massachusetts State Police, and the rear hallway is sealed by the loan sharks. His survival instinct completely overrides any remaining pretense of high society composure. He spots the narrow, shadowed archway leading toward the attached three-car garage. Kendra stands directly in his path, still trembling from the brutal exposure of her financial crimes. She reaches out a trembling hand toward her husband, desperately seeking comfort or a shared plan of escape from the devastating wreckage of her social debut. Blake does not offer reassurance. He does not hesitate. He drops his crystal champagne flute onto the hardwood floor, letting it shatter into 100 jagged pieces. He lowers his shoulder and violently shoves Kendra aside with his entire body weight. The sheer force of the impact sends her crashing hard against the polished mahogany banister. Her expensive silver gown catches on the splintered wood, tearing audibly in the dead silence of the room. Blake does not look back to see if she is injured. He sprints desperately through the archway, his polished dress shoes slipping wildly on the imported marble tile. He bursts through the heavy fire door leading into the cavernous garage, slapping his hands blindly against the wall to find the light switch. The overhead fluorescent bulbs flicker to life, illuminating his rented luxury sports car. He fumbles frantically through the pockets of his tailored navy tuxedo, his hands shaking so violently he can barely grip the electronic key fob. He presses the unlock button repeatedly, hearing the sharp chirp of the vehicle alarm confirming his escape vehicle is ready. He lunges for the driver's side door, convinced he has outsmarted the trap. Before Blake's trembling fingers can even pull the sleek metallic door handle, two heavy shadows detach themselves from the dark corners of the garage. The state police officers stationed outside had completely anticipated his cowardly retreat. They surge forward with terrifying practiced speed. The lead officer drives his shoulder directly into Blake's chest, lifting him entirely off his feet. The breath leaves Blake's lungs in a sharp, painful wheeze as he is slammed violently face first onto the pristine hood of the rented sports car. The expensive metal buckles under his weight. The second officer immediately grabs Blake's flailing wrists, twisting them sharply behind his back and pinning him aggressively against the cold steel. Blake screams in pain, demanding they release him wildly, threatening to sue the entire police department for police brutality. His arrogant threats are instantly silenced by the rhythmic, unhurried clicking of hard leather shoes approaching from the mudroom. Gavin Wright steps calmly into the harsh fluorescent light of the garage. He holds a second, distinctly different legal folder in his left hand. This one does not bear the red stamp of the state registry. It bears the severe, uncompromising seal of a federal magistrate. Gavin stops directly beside the pinned, struggling con artist. He looks down at Blake with pure professional disgust. He announces in a loud, commanding voice that the local police are not here simply to enforce a trespassing violation. They are acting in direct coordination with federal authorities. Gavin explains that the audio recording Alton captured just hours ago on the front porch was immediately forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That recording provided undeniable concrete proof of Blake explicitly promising the fraudulent transfer of a $3.6 million estate to clear an illegal gambling syndicate debt. Gavin opens the heavy federal folder and formally reads the charges. Blake is officially under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and attempting to utilize severely falsified property deeds across state lines to secure illicit financial loans. Every single fraudulent document Blake signed, every fake asset declaration he submitted, and every recorded promise he made to the criminal syndicate has been cataloged, verified, and weaponized against him. The federal warrant is ironclad. There will be absolutely no bail, no high-priced defense strategy, and no miraculous escape. Kendra stumbles into the garage just as the federal charges are read aloud. She leans heavily against the metal door frame, her torn silver gown dragging across the oil-stained concrete floor. She stares at her husband in absolute shock, her mind desperately trying to reject the undeniable reality of his criminal exposure. She calls out his name, her voice cracking with pathetic, lingering hope that he might possess a brilliant explanation to clear their names. Blake turns his head, pressing his bruised cheek flat against the cold hood of the sports car. He glares at her with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He does not offer a loving apology or beg for her understanding. He unleashes a vicious, venomous tirade that echoes violently off the concrete walls. He screams obscenities at her, calling her a pathetic, useless pawn who catastrophically failed her only assignment. He explicitly states that he never loved her and never cared about her manufactured high society ambitions. He reveals he only married her because she was arrogant enough to believe she could easily manipulate a wealthy, aging father into handing over a massive coastal estate. He needed a gullible insider to secure the ultimate bag, and she was the perfect desperate target. He viciously mocks her vanity, telling her that her pathetic desperation to belong to the elite class made her the easiest mark of his entire criminal career. The grand, sweeping romance she believed she had secured was nothing but a calculated, predatory financial transaction. Every sweet promise he made, every luxurious gift he offered, and the entire wedding ceremony was a meticulously orchestrated stage play designed entirely to steal Alton's hard-earned millions. The brutal truth shatters the final remaining fragments of Kendra's manufactured reality. The heavy steel handcuffs click sharply around Blake's wrists, locking into place with a definitive metallic finality. The officers haul him roughly off the dented hood of the rented sports car and drag him toward the waiting police cruisers idling in the freezing driveway. The loan sharks lingering near the perimeter watch his departure with cold, calculating silence, knowing the federal prison system will not erase his debt to their syndicate. Kendra stands completely frozen on the bottom step of the porch. The icy Atlantic wind whips her torn silver dress around her ankles. She stares into the empty darkness of the driveway, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her absolute ruin. In a matter of a few brutal minutes, she has lost absolutely everything. Her fraudulent husband is headed to federal prison. Her stolen coastal fortune has reverted entirely to a charitable orphanage. Her highly curated social standing has been completely obliterated in front of the exact elite peers she desperately worshipped. She is completely isolated, stripped of her stolen wealth, and entirely abandoned to face the devastating consequences of her own ruthless greed. The red and blue emergency lights fade into the freezing coastal night as the state police cruisers accelerate down the long gravel driveway. The heavy tires crush the frost-covered stones, carrying Blake away to a federal holding cell. The violent, chaotic energy that just consumed the grand foyer instantly evaporates. It is rapidly replaced by a frantic, nervous energy from the remaining hired help. The exclusive catering crew works with terrifying speed to dismantle the extravagant banquet. They strip the pristine white linens from the tables and hastily pack their silver serving trays into heavy plastic crates. No one speaks a single word. They simply want to escape the radioactive fallout of a high society federal scam. Within 20 minutes, the private catering trucks roll out of the wrought iron gates, leaving the property entirely empty. The string quartet and the jazz band are long gone. The massive crystal chandeliers still blaze brilliantly from the vaulted cedar ceilings, but they now illuminate an absolute void. The sprawling $3.6 million estate falls into a haunting, hollow silence. Only the sound of the violent Atlantic waves crashing against the rocky shoreline remains. The luxury sports cars and dark sedans have all fled, leaving the expansive driveway entirely desolate. The grand illusion Kendra meticulously constructed has been completely dismantled, stripped down to the frozen earth. She stands alone on the bottom step of the cedar porch. The biting winter wind tears at the ripped fabric of her expensive silver evening gown. The sharp cold bites her bare arms, but she does not move to seek shelter inside the warm house. She knows the house no longer belongs to her. She is a trespasser standing in the ruins of her own catastrophic greed. I stand a few yards away watching the absolute destruction settle over her. Kendra slowly turns her head and locks her tear-filled eyes onto my faded gray canvas jacket. The severe shock paralyzing her limbs finally breaks. She lets out a desperate guttural sob and collapses onto the freezing gravel. She does not maintain her aristocratic posture. She scrambles forward on her bare knees, dragging her torn silver gown through the freezing dirt and crushed stones. She reaches me and throws her arms around my legs. Her manicured hands desperately grip the rough leather of my steel-toed boots. She looks up at me with dark makeup running down her pale cheeks. She begs me to help her. She frantically pleads with me to hire Gavin Wright or the most expensive criminal defense team in Boston to save Blake from federal prison. She screams that Blake is her husband, and that I must step in to protect my family from ruin. She claims that we share the same blood and that a father cannot simply abandon his only daughter in her darkest hour. She insists that I have the financial power to reverse this entire nightmare. She demands I use my hidden wealth to pay off the syndicate creditors and bury the federal fraud charges. She is entirely delusional, still believing my resources exist solely to shield her from the devastating consequences of her own actions. I look down at the weeping, broken woman clinging to my boots. I feel absolutely zero emotion. The deep well of paternal instinct that defined my entire life is completely dry. I do not see the little girl I once protected. I only see a ruthless parasite who willingly participated in a plot to strip me of my home, my sanity, and my life savings. I reach down and firmly grasp her wrists. I pry her desperate, trembling fingers off my leather boots one by one. I step backward, breaking physical contact with her permanently. I reach into the cab of my idling truck and retrieve a large, heavy plastic garment bag. I drop the thick plastic bag directly onto the frozen gravel at her knees. The bag contains the custom-imported silk wedding dress she wore when she married Blake. I tell her I retrieved the dress from her Chicago apartment before driving to the coast. I inform her that she can keep the gown. I state clearly that she bought that specific dress using the $8,000 she fraudulently wired out of my private medical emergency fund while I was fighting a severe respiratory infection in the hospital. I tell her to consider the stolen dress my final permanent contribution to her spectacular high society debut. She stares at the plastic bag, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Kendra stammers wildly, attempting to invoke our biological connection one last time. She cries out that I am her father and she is my own flesh and blood. I stop her with a sharp, undeniable truth. I tell her our blood tie ended the exact second she decided my working-class presence was too humiliating to be seen at her wedding. I remind her of the brutal, freezing Chicago nights I spent waist-deep in raw sewage, working emergency municipal plumbing repairs just to afford her elite private school tuition and her first custom pageant dresses. I built my entire existence around elevating her above my own struggles. I tell her she repaid a lifetime of grueling physical sacrifice with calculated theft and absolute public rejection. She looked at my calloused hands and my faded work boots and deemed me unfit to stand in the very house I built for her mother. I state that she cannot banish a man for being a blue-collar embarrassment and then beg that same man to act as her billionaire savior. I turn my back on her weeping form. I do not offer a single word of comfort or a final piece of fatherly advice. Gavin Wright and director Miriam step out from the shadows of the porch and walk silently toward my idling diesel truck. Miriam clutches the original irrevocable deed to the orphanage tightly against her chest. Gavin opens the passenger door for her, his face a mask of profound professional satisfaction. I climb into the driver's seat and pull the heavy door shut, sealing out the bitter coastal wind. I shift the heavy transmission into gear and press the accelerator. The diesel engine roars to life, its low mechanical rumble vibrating through the frozen earth. As the truck rolls slowly down the long gravel driveway, I look in the rearview mirror one final time. Kendra remains on her knees in the dirt, clutching the plastic garment bag against her chest. Her agonizing, desperate screams echo violently into the freezing night air, completely ignored by the crashing ocean waves. She is entirely isolated, stripped of her stolen wealth, and abandoned to face the brutal reality of her actions alone. The legal execution is perfectly complete. The biting chill of the Chicago morning air feels entirely different from the bitter coastal winds of Massachusetts. 3 days have passed since the flashing police lights reflected off the ocean water and the rented luxury cars fled the estate in absolute panic. I sit heavily on the worn wooden steps of my own front porch. The familiar sounds of the South Side wake up around me. Heavy delivery trucks rumble down the avenue and my hardworking neighbors shuffle out to their cars for early morning shifts. I hold a chipped ceramic mug in both my calloused hands, letting the thick steam from the strong black coffee warm my weathered face. My small, modest house stands firmly behind me, solid and completely paid for. The quiet peace of the neighborhood is a stark grounding contrast to the absolute chaos I left behind on the East Coast. I take a slow sip of the bitter coffee, appreciating the simple reality of a life built on honest, exhausting labor rather than manufactured illusions and stolen credit. The peace is abruptly shattered by the harsh vibrating buzz of my cell phone resting on the wooden railing. The screen illuminates, casting a pale, artificial glow against the peeling white paint of the porch. I set my mug down carefully. The caller ID flashes with a stark, unmistakable origin. It is an automated institutional number from a federal correctional facility holding center in Massachusetts. The digital text crawls across the cracked screen, signaling the inevitable collision of consequences. I do not rush to pick up the device. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the persistent electronic hum vibrate against the wood. When I finally drag my thumb across the screen to accept the incoming call, an automated robotic voice immediately requests authorization to accept a collect call from a federal inmate. I press the confirmation key and raise the phone slowly to my ear. The line clicks over and the dead air is instantly filled with frantic, hyperventilating sobs. Kendra does not sound like the immaculate, untouchable heiress standing on a grand cedar staircase in a shimmering silver gown. She sounds entirely broken. Her voice cracks wildly as she screams my name through the receiver, begging me not to hang up. She speaks in rapid, panicked bursts, her words tumbling over each other in sheer desperation. She tells me that armed federal agents raided her apartment less than 48 hours after the wedding disaster. Because Blake had ruthlessly used her as a convenient pawn, her signature was plastered across all the fraudulent joint accounts he used to launder his stolen funds and secure his illicit loans. The authorities did not care about her manufactured ignorance or her desperate claims of innocence. They moved with absolute surgical precision, entirely freezing every single bank account, credit card, and physical asset tied to her name. She explains through choking tears that she was arrested in the middle of the night, dragged out of her upscale apartment in handcuffs and formally charged as a willing accessory to a massive federal conspiracy. Her perfectly curated life has been completely demolished. She tells me she is currently standing in a freezing holding cell, wearing a canvas uniform and surrounded by people who terrify her. The judge has set her bail at a staggering $100,000, a sum she absolutely cannot access with her accounts completely locked by the government. Kendra shifts from explaining her horrific reality to executing a desperate, pathetic emotional manipulation. She begs me to go to the bank immediately. She demands I take out a second mortgage on my small Chicago house and leverage the deed to my plumbing garage to secure her massive bond. She cries violently, making frantic promises that she has completely changed, that the traumatic arrest has opened her eyes, and that she will dedicate the rest of her life to paying me back. She swears she finally understands the value of family and insists that I am the only person left in the entire world who can save her from a lengthy federal prison sentence. Her high society friends completely abandoned her the second the federal handcuffs clicked. The elite peers she spent months desperately impressing will not even accept her phone calls. She fully expects me to absorb the total financial devastation of her actions, demanding I sacrifice my hard-earned retirement to rescue her from a cage she willingly built herself. I listen to her hyperventilating pleas, keeping the phone pressed firmly to my ear. I do not feel a single ounce of paternal urgency. Instead, my mind flashes back to a distinct conversation we had exactly 1 year ago. Kendra had just signed the lease on her upscale downtown apartment, the one she secured using money secretly funneled from my accounts. I had offered to drive my heavy work truck into the city to bring her a handcrafted dining table I spent 3 weeks sanding and staining for her new dining room. I remember the exact pitch of her voice when she rejected my offer. Her tone was sharp, condescending, and laced with absolute embarrassment. She explicitly banned me from attending her housewarming party, telling me that the sight of my scuffed work boots and my faded canvas jacket would completely ruin the sophisticated aesthetic she was trying to project. She treated my honest labor as a toxic disease that would infect her new, pristine social circle. She casually discarded my presence just to maintain a fragile illusion for total strangers. Kendra stops her frantic crying, waiting breathlessly for my response. She expects the unconditional, foolish salvation I provided her entire life. I look out at the quiet Chicago street and grip the phone tightly. I speak in an icy, completely flat tone that carries absolutely zero emotion. I do not offer comfort or entertain her desperate negotiations. I simply recite the exact sentence she delivered to me when she banished me from her apartment a year ago. I tell her that this is a matter for the elite. A retired carpenter has no place here. The dead silence that follows my words is profound. I do not wait for her to scream or beg or attempt another pathetic apology. I pull the phone away from my ear and press the red button, cutting the connection with absolute finality. I open the caller settings and permanently block the institutional number. I set the phone down on the wooden railing, pick up my black coffee, and take a long, satisfying sip. Kendra's terrified screams are left entirely trapped behind the thick concrete walls of a federal holding facility. She is completely alone. The fluorescent lights of the downtown Chicago precinct buzzed with a harsh, relentless electrical hum, casting a sickly pale illumination over the scuffed linoleum floor. I sat perfectly still in a cold metal chair securely bolted directly to the ground of Interrogation Room 4. The walls were painted a suffocating, institutional shade of gray, completely devoid of windows, clocks, or any trace of human warmth. A heavy scratched steel table sat between me and the reinforced security door. I folded my calloused hands and waited patiently in the heavy, oppressive silence. The district attorney had called me in personally earlier that morning. They required a formal victim impact statement and a final sworn confirmation of the exact monetary damages regarding the $80,000 completely drained from my private accounts. The Regional Financial Crimes Division had spent the last 3 consecutive days aggressively tracing every single fraudulent wire transfer Kendra executed to fund her fake high society lifestyle. The federal agents had successfully and definitively linked her direct electronic signatures to the massive depletion of my medical emergency fund. I brought the certified bank statements with me, carrying the undeniable proof of her betrayal inside a plain manila envelope resting on the metal table. I did not feel out of place or intimidated in the stark, unforgiving room. The freezing, sterile environment perfectly matched the absolute emptiness currently resting in my chest. The heavy steel door finally clicked open with a loud, echoing metallic clank. The district attorney, a sharp, unyielding woman in a tailored black suit, stepped inside and nodded to me respectfully. She took her place against the far corner wall, holding a thick legal clipboard tightly against her chest. A uniformed county sheriff followed immediately behind her. He held a thick metal chain connected directly to a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Kendra shuffled slowly into the sterile room. She wore a bright orange county correctional jumpsuit that hung loosely and awkwardly over her trembling frame. The heavy chains rattled sharply against the metal table as the sheriff forcefully directed her to the bolted chair opposite me. Her pristine, highly curated aristocratic image was completely and permanently eradicated. Her hair hung in greasy, unkempt strands around her pale face, and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes revealed days of intense sleep deprivation and constant panic. She did not look at me with any trace of remorse or guilt for the destruction she caused. She looked at me with absolute concentrated hatred. She leaned her chained hands forward against the cold steel table and viciously blamed me for orchestrating her entire downfall. She sneered, her voice raspy and venomous, accusing me of deliberately waiting until the exact moment of her wedding reception to completely destroy her life out of pure, malicious spite. She claimed I could have warned her privately about Blake or stopped the charity transfer behind closed doors, but I chose to publicly humiliate her because I was deeply jealous of her ascending social status. She demanded to know how a father could be so ruthless and vindictive toward his own flesh and blood. I did not raise my voice or react to her toxic, hysterical venom. I reached into my manila envelope and pulled out the thick stack of highlighted bank records. I raised the documents high and slammed them down flat onto the metal table with a deafening crack that made her flinch. I told her I did not introduce her to a dangerous criminal syndicate, and I did not force her to sign fraudulent financial documents. I pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the printed transaction logs. I systematically stated that her own profound greed and absolute stupidity sealed her fate. She actively chose to log into my secure accounts. She actively chose to wire $80,000 of my hard-earned survival money to fake catering vendors and imported dress designers. She actively chose to marry a broke, desperate con artist simply because he promised her the illusion of a lavish coastal estate. I informed her that I did not orchestrate her ruin. I merely provided the exact rope she enthusiastically used to hang herself. Kendra glared at the bank statements, her chest heaving rapidly as she struggled to find another weak excuse to deflect her profound guilt. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the cold table, closing the physical distance between us, to deliver a final, undeniable truth. I told her that for 30 years I operated tirelessly as her dedicated human shield. Whenever she made a reckless mistake, failed an academic pursuit, or ruined a financial opportunity, I stepped in immediately to absorb the complete damage. I worked crushing, bone-breaking double shifts in the freezing Chicago winters to pay off her mounting, irresponsible credit card debts. I sacrificed my own physical health, skipped medical treatments, and ignored my own retirement security to ensure she never felt the cold, hard sting of failure. I built an impenetrable fortress around her, and she repaid that total, unwavering devotion by treating me like a disposable blue-collar embarrassment. She viewed my endless, grueling protection not as love, but as a foolish, easily exploitable weakness designed solely to fund her shallow vanity. I stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that I did not actively destroy her life or sabotage her future. I simply stopped stepping in front of the bullets she carelessly fired. I completely removed the protective barrier I had maintained for decades and finally allowed reality to deliver the exact consequences she had forcefully earned. By stepping back and letting the world treat her exactly the way she treated others, her entire manufactured existence collapsed instantly under its own corrupt weight. The district attorney pushed away from the gray wall and stepped purposefully up to the metal table. She opened her clipboard and placed a dense, legally binding contract directly over the scattered bank statements. She looked down at Kendra with zero professional sympathy or hesitation. She coldly informed my daughter that the federal wire fraud and accessory conspiracy charges carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The prosecutor stated explicitly that Kendra possessed only one single option to avoid a devastating decade behind bars. She had to sign a full, unconditional plea agreement admitting to felony grand theft directly against her own father. By signing, she would accept a lesser sentence and guarantee full financial restitution to my accounts. Kendra stared at the black ink on the plea deal. The last remaining trace of her arrogant defiance completely shattered. Her shoulders violently collapsed inward and she let out a hollow, agonizing wail. Her chained hands shook uncontrollably as the sheriff unclipped her right wrist, placing a cheap plastic pen between her trembling fingers. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed the document, weeping uncontrollably onto the metal table as her absolute ruin became a permanent legal record. Exactly 2 months later, the sterile, windowless confines of the county interrogation room have been entirely replaced by the towering, solemn architecture of the federal courthouse in downtown Boston. I sit quietly in the very last row of the polished mahogany gallery. The heavy wooden bench is unyielding and rigid against my back, serving as a physical reminder of the severe, uncompromising nature of the justice system. The grand courtroom smells faintly of floor wax, old paper, and stale, heavily filtered air conditioning. The high ceilings and thick sound-dampening walls swallow every minor sound, creating an atmosphere of absolute suffocating finality. I am wearing my only dark suit, a simple tailored garment I usually reserve for weddings and funerals. My deeply calloused hands rest flat and motionless against my knees. I do not fidget. I do not check my watch. I simply observe the massive seal of the federal government mounted securely behind the judge's elevated bench. The passage of 60 days has completely drained the chaotic, frantic energy from this entire ordeal. The dramatic arrests, the frantic jailhouse phone calls, and the desperate interrogation room negotiations have all solidified into cold, undeniable legal proceedings. The sprawling coastal estate is officially and permanently under the control of the orphanage, securely protected by an impenetrable federal trust. The underground syndicate creditors have been forced back into the shadows by the overwhelming presence of federal investigators. The stage is entirely set for the final, inescapable delivery of consequences. I am not here to gloat or revel in the destruction of my daughter's life. I am here simply to witness the absolute closure of a chapter that cost me my life savings and my paternal blind faith. The heavy side door opens and the bailiff instructs the sparsely populated room to rise. The federal judge takes his seat with a heavy, practiced authority. He is a stern, silver-haired man who reviews the massive stack of case files through thick reading glasses. He does not waste a single second on pleasantries. He calls Blake forward first. My former son-in-law stands up from the defense table, his wrists secured by heavy metal chains. He is no longer draped in a bespoke Italian tuxedo or flashing a practiced, charismatic smile. He wears a standard-issue faded beige correctional facility uniform. His posture is completely defeated, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of multiple federal indictments. The judge sternly addresses the massive scope of his wire fraud, the calculated manipulation of real estate documents, and his extensive conspiracy to defraud both private citizens and violent criminal syndicates. The judge looks up from his files and notes the absolute striking emptiness of the gallery directly behind the defense table. Blake's supposedly elite influential family is nowhere to be found. The powerful political connections and wealthy socialite friends he endlessly bragged about have completely evaporated. He is entirely abandoned, proving that his entire world was nothing more than a shallow transactional illusion. The judge does not offer a shred of leniency. He hands down a definitive, unappealable sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Blake's knees buckle slightly as the reality of 96 months behind bars crashes into him. He is immediately escorted out of the courtroom by 2 armed marshals, disappearing through a heavy steel door without looking back. The court clerk then calls Kendra's name. She slowly stands up beside her state-appointed public defender. She wears a plain, conservative gray blouse and dark slacks, looking entirely drained of the arrogant vanity that once defined her every movement. She keeps her eyes glued firmly to the hardwood floor. The judge pulls her signed confession and binding plea agreement from the top of the stack. He explicitly addresses her severe, calculated breach of familial trust. He states clearly that her willingness to actively assist a known con artist in defrauding her own father represents a profound moral failure. However, because she signed the unconditional plea deal and provided full cooperation regarding Blake's broader financial crimes, the court accepts the negotiated terms. The judge announces that she will entirely avoid serving time in a federal prison cell. Instead, she is handed a sentence of 5 years of extremely strict, highly monitored probation. She will be subjected to random home inspections, mandatory travel restrictions, and absolute financial surveillance. She avoids the iron bars of a cell, but her daily life will be entirely controlled and monitored by the state. She stands perfectly still, absorbing the severe restrictions placed upon her freedom. The judge then shifts his focus strictly to the financial damages. He explicitly mandates full, uncompromising financial restitution as a non-negotiable condition of her continued probation. Every single cent of the $80,000 she methodically drained from my private medical emergency fund must be completely repaid to my accounts. The judge dictates the precise mathematics of her new reality. Because she is now officially a convicted felon with a massive federal fraud charge permanently attached to her public record, her employment opportunities in any corporate or high society sector are permanently destroyed. She will be forced to secure entry-level minimum wage labor. The state will aggressively garnish her meager paychecks, stripping away a massive percentage of her earnings every single month until the entire $80,000 is returned. I listen quietly as the judge outlines her grueling future. The absolute irony of her punishment settles heavily over the room. She was willing to steal my survival money to buy her way out of the working class. Now she will spend the next decade of her adult life trapped in the exact same exhausting blue-collar grind she always considered beneath her. The judge strikes his wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. He formally dismisses the court and swiftly exits through his private chambers. The bailiffs immediately move to unlock the low wooden gates, signaling the conclusion of the morning session. The court reporter begins aggressively packing away her stenography equipment. Kendra's public defender whispers a final brief instruction into her ear before turning and walking rapidly down the center aisle, eager to move on to his next appointed case. Kendra is left standing entirely alone at the defense table. She slowly turns around, her hands trembling uncontrollably at her sides. She scans the sparse, cavernous gallery. Her bloodshot, exhausted eyes finally find me sitting perfectly motionless in the back row. The physical distance between us feels like an insurmountable canyon. She takes a deep, ragged breath and shifts her weight. Her face contorts into an expression of desperate, agonizing sorrow. She steps away from the heavy wooden table and physically prepares to walk down the long center aisle toward me. She is gathering her remaining strength to approach the father she threw away, preparing to beg for one absolute final plea of mercy. Alton rises from the hard wooden bench in the back row before Kendra can even utter a single syllable inside the courtroom. He turns his back on the defense table, pushes open the heavy oak double doors, and steps out into the expansive, brightly lit marble hallway of the federal courthouse. The natural sunlight streaming through the massive glass skylights reflects harshly off the polished stone floor, forcing him to squint. He buttons his dark suit jacket, the simple fabric feeling stiff, but acting like a necessary layer of armor. His breathing is remarkably steady. The heavy, suffocating weight of the trial, the fraud, and the relentless emotional manipulation is entirely gone. The echo of leather dress shoes and quiet, urgent conversations from other legal proceedings fills the long, vaulted corridor. A few seconds later, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creak open behind him. Kendra shuffles out into the blinding light of the hallway. She looks completely destroyed. Her conservative gray blouse is deeply wrinkled, and the cheap, unfamiliar fabric hangs awkwardly off her slumping, defeated frame. Her face is ghostly pale, entirely stripped of the expensive cosmetics and arrogant confidence that previously defined her entire existence. She spots Alton walking steadily toward the main security exit. She immediately picks up her pace, dragging her feet heavily across the pristine marble tile. She moves with the desperate, erratic, and uncoordinated energy of a drowning victim suddenly spotting a final piece of floating wreckage. She reaches out a trembling hand, her voice cracking sharply as she calls out his name. She forces her exhausted legs to move faster, desperately trying to intercept him before he reaches the security checkpoint. The vast, echoing hallway feels like a long, unforgiving tunnel as she rapidly closes the physical distance, preparing to unleash her final desperate negotiation for survival. Kendra throws herself directly into Alton's path, aggressively cutting off his route to the exit doors. She opens her mouth, a fresh wave of pathetic tears instantly spilling over her bruised, dark-circled eyes. Her voice shakes violently as she begs for a place to stay, frantically pleading that she has absolutely nowhere to go. She claims her upscale apartment was permanently seized by the government, her bank accounts are entirely frozen, and her former high society friends have completely blocked her number. She promises she will sleep on the old dusty couch in his Chicago basement, swearing repeatedly that she will do any manual labor to earn her keep if he just gives her a second chance. She tries to grab the sleeve of his dark suit jacket, seeking the familiar, unconditional comfort she so ruthlessly exploited for decades. Alton does not break his stride. He does not raise his hands to push her away or raise his voice in vindictive anger. He simply sidesteps her outstretched hand with smooth, calculated precision and continues walking at the exact same pace. He looks directly through her as if she is constructed of entirely transparent glass. He offers absolutely zero reaction to her weeping, treating her desperate pleas as nothing more than the ambient background noise of the busy courthouse. The ultimate punishment he delivers is not fiery hatred or malicious rage. It is complete, absolute indifference. His unyielding silence strikes her harder than any physical blow ever could. He does not view her as a daughter or an enemy. He simply does not view her at all. She is entirely erased from his reality. The realization of his utter indifference crashes into Kendra with devastating, paralyzing force. Her knees buckle instantly under the crushing weight of her new, inescapable existence. She staggers backward and collapses heavily onto a hard wooden bench lining the courthouse wall. She gasps for air, staring blankly at the polished marble floor between her cheap shoes. The magnificent, glittering high society dream she explicitly sold her soul to achieve has burned completely to ash. There will be no more imported champagne, no exclusive coastal galas, and no custom designer gowns. The brutal mechanics of the federal judge's sentencing echo relentlessly in her mind. Every paycheck she earns for the foreseeable future will be ruthlessly garnished by the government. She will spend the next 10 years of her life scrubbing floors, serving tables, or wiping down industrial counters just to survive. Every single grueling, minimum wage shift she works will be dedicated entirely to paying back the $80,000 she stole from the father who just walked past her without a second glance. The exact blue-collar labor she viewed with absolute disgust is now her permanent, inescapable prison. She chose to steal. She actively chose to marry a manipulative con man. She buries her face in her hands, weeping uncontrollably in the bright hallway, utterly alone. Alton pushes through the heavy revolving glass doors of the federal building and steps out into the crisp, biting afternoon air of downtown Boston. The sharp urban wind hits his face, but he genuinely welcomes the biting cold. He takes a long, deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh coastal air. For 30 consecutive years, he spent every waking moment carrying the crushing, emotional, and financial weight of a daughter who secretly despised him. He had willingly absorbed her constant failures, eagerly funded her endless vanity, and continuously offered his calloused hands for her to step on as she climbed toward a life she arrogantly believed she deserved. He had broken his back trying to earn the basic respect of a child who only saw him as a walking, exploitable bank account. Today, that toxic parasitic bond is completely and legally severed. He walks down the wide concrete steps leading to the bustling public plaza. His broad shoulders, usually hunched from decades of heavy lifting and immense paternal anxiety, feel remarkably light. The invisible, suffocating chains of obligation and unrequited love have been permanently shattered. He is no longer a tool to be casually discarded. He is simply a free man moving forward. As Alton reaches the bottom of the wide courthouse steps, a familiar figure falls into a brisk, synchronized step right beside him. Gavin Wright adjusts the dark collar of his sharp wool overcoat against the chilling wind, his expression projecting crisp, professional satisfaction. He does not mention the intense courtroom drama or the crying woman left behind on the wooden bench in the marble hallway. Instead, Gavin reaches into his sleek leather briefcase and smoothly withdraws a thick roll of pristine, freshly printed architectural blueprints. He hands the heavy-rolled documents directly to Alton without breaking his rapid stride. Gavin speaks in a clear, energized tone, outlining the immediate, highly anticipated future. He confirms that the extensive federal trust paperwork has been flawlessly finalized, and the local coastal zoning board has aggressively fast-tracked all their construction permits. The massive renovation of the sprawling estate is officially clear to commence immediately. The magnificent property will be fully transformed from a stolen symbol of aristocratic greed into a permanent summer retreat for the Haven Orphanage. Gavin looks at the retired carpenter with a rare, genuine smile and states that the heavy demolition crews arrive on site at dawn. The real work begins tomorrow morning. The freezing coastal winter has finally begun to thaw, yielding to the crisp, salty air of an early New England spring. I stand dead center inside the sprawling grand foyer of the Martha's Vineyard estate. The heavy, suffocating silence that occupied this massive structure just 2 months ago has been completely eradicated. It is replaced by the deafening mechanical roar of industrial circular saws and the relentless rhythmic pounding of heavy steel hammers. Thick clouds of white drywall dust float through the high vaulted ceilings, catching the bright morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A dedicated crew of 24 local contractors swarms the property, moving with urgent, synchronized precision. They carry thick wooden beams, heavy steel brackets, and massive sheets of fresh drywall through the oversized cedar doors. The atmosphere is charged with a frantic, purposeful energy. This is no longer a superficial staging ground for high society illusions or a fraudulent asset waiting to be leveraged by underground syndicates. The $3.6 million property is undergoing a massive structural metamorphosis. I watch a crew of laborers carry a stack of heavy commercial fire doors up the grand cedar staircase. The pristine, untouched aesthetic of a billionaire's summer retreat is being actively dismantled, replaced by the durable, practical infrastructure required to safely house dozens of energetic children. I step over a tangled web of thick yellow extension cords and walk deeper into the belly of the house. The transformation is aggressive and immediate. The air smells strongly of fresh-cut pine, wet paint, and burning sawdust. I pull a pair of thick leather work gloves out of my back pocket and slide them onto my hands. The time for observing is over. There is physical labor required, and my calloused hands have been itching for a heavy tool since the moment I signed the federal trust papers. I walk directly into the expansive back wing of the estate. This massive area was originally segmented into 3 redundant formal dining rooms and a private cigar lounge that Blake meticulously designed to entertain his phantom investors. Right now, a team of 6 men is actively knocking down the non-load-bearing partitions. They are violently stripping away the dark imported mahogany paneling that Blake had custom ordered. The heavy walls crash to the hardwood floor in massive splintering chunks. By opening up this entire wing, we are creating 2 gigantic sunlit dormitory spaces that will soon hold rows of sturdy wooden bunk beds. I nod to the foreman and step past the falling debris, making my way toward the center of the main entertainment hall. Sitting in the middle of the room is the custom-built imported white marble wet bar. It is a massive, incredibly pretentious monument to Kendra's delusional vanity. She had demanded its installation during the initial renovation, completely tearing out the original brick fireplace to make room for a structure she believed would impress the coastal elite. The polished stone gleams under the temporary construction lights, looking completely ridiculous and utterly useless for an orphanage retreat. I walk over to a heavy canvas tool bag resting on the floor and pull out a solid steel 12-pound sledgehammer. I grip the thick fiberglass handle with both hands, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the tool. I step squarely up to the edge of the pristine white marble. I brace my boots against the floorboards, pull the heavy hammer back over my shoulder, and swing it forward with absolute unrestricted force. The solid steel head collides directly with the center of the marble slab. A deafening explosive crack echoes over the sound of the power saws. Thick spiderwebs of fractured stone instantly spread across the expensive surface. I pull the hammer back and swing again, driving the steel head down even harder. The pretension shatters completely. The marble caves inward, breaking into hundreds of jagged, useless pieces that crash onto the floor. I do not stop until the entire structure is demolished, reduced to a pile of expensive rubble that will be shoveled into a rolling dumpster before noon. I lower the hammer, my chest heaving slightly, and wipe a layer of white dust from my forehead. I turn my attention to the large bay windows looking out over the back property. I signal the lead landscape architect standing on the patio. I point aggressively to the barren, heavily compacted patch of frozen dirt near the property line. I instruct him to bring in the small excavators and tear up the ruined soil where Blake had unceremoniously ripped out the garden. I hand the landscaper a detailed schematic demanding he replant Cora's vintage yellow roses exactly as they were laid out 30 years ago. Every violent swing of the heavy sledgehammer sends a shockwave up my arms, acting as a profound, intensely therapeutic release. For months, this house represented the absolute darkest period of my entire existence. It was a suffocating monument to horrific betrayal, calculated deception, and the total destruction of my family. Every square inch of the property was stained by Kendra's boundless greed and Blake's ruthless predatory ambition. I had walked these halls feeling like a ghost, completely isolated and utterly powerless against the syndicate machinery that sought to drain my life savings. But right now, the toxic history of the house is being violently and permanently scrubbed away. We are tearing out the rot down to the foundational studs. The arrogant, fraudulent layers are being ripped off and thrown into the garbage. The house is being fundamentally cleansed, actively making room for entirely pure intentions. The legacy of this estate will no longer be defined by a massive federal fraud conviction or a destroyed father. It will be defined by the laughter and safety of children who desperately need a secure foundation. I toss the battered sledgehammer onto the floor and strip off my dusty leather gloves. My cell phone vibrates aggressively inside my canvas jacket pocket. I pull it out and accept the incoming call, immediately hearing Director Miriam's vibrant, unmistakable voice echoing through the receiver. She sounds breathless, practically vibrating with intense, uncontainable excitement. She skips the standard pleasantries and delivers a rapid, critical update. She informs me that the State Child Welfare Agency has aggressively expedited their approval process based on the emergency federal trust backing the property. The logistical timeline has been massively accelerated. Miriam tells me that the very first chartered bus carrying exactly 30 foster children will pull through the wrought iron gates of the estate this coming Saturday morning. We have exactly 4 days to transform the active construction zone into a fully operational welcoming sanctuary. I thank Miriam, feeling a powerful surge of adrenaline spike through my chest. I end the call and slide the phone back into my jacket. I look at the massive empty dormitory spaces waiting for furniture. I roll up the sleeves of my flannel shirt and reach for my heavy leather carpenter belt. The commercial bunk beds need to be built immediately. The crisp, salty breeze of Saturday morning sweeps off the Atlantic, carrying the distinct scent of blooming vintage roses and fresh cedar. The sprawling coastal estate is entirely unrecognizable from the cold, sterile fortress it was just 4 days ago. The pretentious marble bar is completely gone, replaced by long, sturdy oak dining tables polished to a warm shine. The dark, isolated cigar lounges have been violently transformed into bright, sunlit dormitories filled with rows of solid, hand-built wooden bunk beds. I stand on the expansive back porch, wiping the last traces of sawdust from my calloused hands. The heavy mechanical rumble of a large diesel engine breaks the tranquil rhythm of the crashing ocean waves. A bright yellow chartered school bus slowly navigates the long gravel driveway, its heavy tires crunching loudly over the crushed stones. The air brakes hiss sharply as the massive vehicle comes to a complete halt right in front of the Grand Cedar entrance. The heavy hydraulic doors swing open with a sharp mechanical thud. The profound, haunting silence that once choked this property is instantly and permanently shattered. Dozens of foster children pour out of the bus, their excited, chaotic voices echoing across the vibrant green lawn. They carry small, worn duffel bags and tightly clutched backpacks, their eyes completely wide with absolute awe. They point frantically at the towering windows, the vast expanse of the open ocean, and the brightly painted trim of the estate. The heavy, oppressive weight of high society vanity has been violently exorcised from the very foundation of the house, instantly replaced by the raw, unfiltered energy of pure joy. I watch them scatter across the grass, running toward the shoreline with unrestricted freedom. The property is finally breathing. Amidst the chaotic whirlwind of shouting children racing eagerly toward the sandy dunes, one small figure remains entirely rooted in place. A young boy no older than 7 lingers nervously near the bottom step of the grand cedar porch. He wears a faded, oversized denim jacket, his small hands gripping the frayed straps of a battered green backpack with white-knuckle intensity. He stares up at the massive vaulted ceilings of the estate with a look of profound, paralyzing intimidation. He does not see a welcoming summer playground. He sees an imposing, untouchable fortress that feels entirely alien to whatever harsh, unforgiving reality he just left behind. He looks down at his scuffed sneakers, physically shrinking into himself, terrified to take a single step forward onto the pristine hardwood floors. I recognize that specific defensive posture immediately. It is the exact physical manifestation of believing you do not belong, of feeling utterly unworthy of standing inside a multi-million-dollar estate. I slowly walk down the wide wooden steps, intentionally keeping my movements calm and measured. I do not rush him or demand he join the chaotic crowd on the lawn. I stop 2 steps above him and lower my large frame, dropping down onto my knees so we are exactly at eye level. He flinches slightly, pulling his backpack tighter against his narrow chest as if preparing for a reprimand. I reach into the deep front pocket of my canvas jacket and pull out a small object. It is a miniature, intricately carved wooden sailboat. I spent the last 3 nights whittling it out of a piece of scrap cedar left over from the new dormitory bunk beds. I hold the small, polished wood out in my open palm, letting the bright morning sunlight catch the smooth curves of the hand-carved hull. The boy slowly raises his head. His dark, guarded eyes shift cautiously from my calloused hands to the wooden toy. I tell him firmly that massive houses and tall ceilings do not make a place important. I explain that walls are just wood and nails, entirely meaningless, unless they actively protect the people standing safely inside them. I gently press the wooden boat into his small, trembling hands. I tell him that the ocean out there can be violent and unpredictable, constantly throwing massive waves that try to knock you completely off balance. But I assure him that every single boat, no matter how small or battered it might seem, absolutely deserves a safe, quiet place to anchor. I look directly into his fearful eyes and state with undeniable certainty that he belongs right here. He does not have to earn his space, and he does not have to pretend to be someone else to stay. This house was rebuilt specifically for him to drop his anchor. The boy runs his small thumb over the smooth, sanded wood of the toy sail. As he looks back up at me, the thick layer of paralyzing fear masking his expression finally fractures. I see a sudden, brilliant flash of defiance and unyielding strength buried deep within his dark eyes. It is the exact same fierce, quiet resilience that defined Cora's entire existence. She spent her life fiercely advocating for the forgotten, constantly fighting to provide shelter for children who were violently tossed aside by a broken, uncaring system. She never cared about elite country clubs, imported crystal chandeliers, or generating a fake aristocratic pedigree. She only cared about building a solid, unbreakable foundation for those who had absolutely nothing. Looking at this quiet, trembling boy holding the wooden boat, the agonizing betrayal of the past few months entirely washes away. This specific moment is the true, undeniable legacy we were always meant to leave behind. We did not work our fingers to the bone for decades to finance a hollow, fraudulent masquerade for greedy socialites. We bled to create a permanent sanctuary, a place where broken pieces could be carefully and lovingly put back together. A slow, genuine smile finally breaks across the young boy's face, entirely erasing the heavy shadows of his troubled past. He carefully tucks the carved wooden boat into the front pocket of his faded denim jacket, ensuring it is completely safe. Without a single word of hesitation, he reaches out his small hand and firmly wraps his fingers around my rough, calloused palm. The sudden physical contact grounds me completely. I stand up, holding his hand securely, and we turn away from the empty gravel driveway. We walk together down the wooden porch steps, stepping off the manicured grass and onto the soft, shifting sand of the coastal dunes. The violent crashing of the Atlantic waves feels welcoming rather than destructive. I look back over my shoulder at the sprawling cedar estate one final time. The massive structure no longer projects a cold, intimidating aura of manufactured wealth or toxic exclusivity. It radiates a deep, undeniable warmth filled entirely with the bright, echoing laughter of children discovering the ocean for the very first time. The hollow, catastrophic illusion has been permanently dismantled. The true foundation has finally been poured, and it is absolutely unbreakable. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the day slowly fades as the sun dips below the Atlantic horizon. The bright blue sky transforms into deep shades of bruised purple and dark indigo, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the coastal estate. The massive cedar house behind me settles into a profound, peaceful quiet. The 30 foster children are completely exhausted from hours of running along the sandy dunes and exploring their new sanctuary. They are now safely tucked into their freshly built wooden bunk beds, sleeping soundly under the protective roof of a fortress finally serving a righteous purpose. The mechanical roar of power tools and the frantic shouting of construction crews have been entirely replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic crashing of the ocean waves against the rocky shoreline. I sit alone on a heavy Adirondack chair facing the water. A large circular stone fire pit sits directly in front of me. The thick logs of split cedar crackle and pop brilliantly in the cooling night air, sending bright orange sparks floating up toward the darkening sky. The biting evening wind carries the sharp, clean scent of salt and burning wood. I lean forward, resting my forearms on my knees, letting the intense heat of the flames warm my calloused hands. The profound tranquility of the moment is absolute. There are no frantic phone calls demanding money, no suffocating layers of deception to navigate, and no toxic obligations weighing down my chest. The sprawling property has been fundamentally cleansed. It breathes with genuine life, standing as a permanent testament to resilience and truth. I sit in the heavy silence, allowing the freezing coastal breeze to wash over my weathered face, fully embracing the quiet reality of a completely reclaimed existence. Resting on my knee is a freshly printed copy of the Boston Regional newspaper. The harsh glare of the firelight illuminates the bold black ink dominating the entire front page. The massive headline aggressively announces the spectacular, catastrophic downfall of Blake's underground criminal empire. The lead investigative journalist has dedicated 4 full columns to detailing the intricate mechanics of the wire fraud, the elaborate shell companies, and the brutal reality of the syndicate debt that completely destroyed my former son-in-law. The article methodically breaks down the entire illusion of the high society lifestyle Blake and Kendra desperately tried to project. It publicly exposes their rented sports cars, their fake catering vendors, and their absolute reliance on stolen funds. The truth is laid out bare for the entire city to consume, stripping away every ounce of their manufactured dignity. Halfway down the page, the tone of the article shifts significantly. The journalist explicitly names me. The text praises my actions with dramatic theatrical language. The writer describes a working-class father who silently endured unimaginable disrespect only to emerge as a brilliant tactical architect of justice. The article frames me as a mastermind who meticulously exposed a massive, highly sophisticated fraud ring through sheer, unrelenting patience and calculated precision. The public narrative demands a hero, and the newspaper has decided to mold my survival into a sensationalized triumph. I read the glowing words outlining my supposed genius. I feel absolutely zero pride. I do not feel a surge of vindication or a desire to frame the article and hang it on a wall. The words ring completely hollow against the quiet reality of my life. I did not execute my actions for glory, public praise, or the satisfaction of seeing my name printed in bold ink. I simply did what was necessary to survive a lethal parasite. I firmly grasp the edges of the newspaper in both hands. I slowly fold the thick pages together, creasing the paper with deliberate force. I lean forward and toss the entire bundle directly into the center of the roaring fire pit. The dry paper catches instantly. A sudden burst of bright yellow flame consumes the front page. I watch intently as the bold headlines curl inward, blacken, and rapidly disintegrate into fragile floating ash. The sensationalized story of my vengeance burns away entirely. The public validation is completely meaningless to me. The sensational narrative evaporates into the cold night air, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, enduring truth of the flames. I watch the final fragments of the newspaper turn to gray dust. The intense heat of the fire mirrors the slow-burning realization settling deep within my chest. For 30 agonizing years, I carried the crushing burden of a daughter who actively despised the very hands that fed her. I traded my own comfort, my financial security, and my personal dignity to maintain a protective barrier around a person who viewed my sacrifice as a humiliating weakness. That toxic history officially holds absolutely no power over me anymore. The deep wounds inflicted by decades of ungratefulness and manipulation have been cauterized completely. I require no public validation to justify the severe boundaries I finally drew. I do not need a journalist to tell me I won, and I do not need the approval of strangers to validate my survival. The quiet, solitary satisfaction of restoring order and executing pure justice is entirely enough. My shoulders feel remarkably light tonight. The grueling, thankless chapter of my life as a disposable human shield is permanently closed. I am finally standing on solid ground, completely unburdened by the ghosts of a broken past. A soft, hesitant tapping against the wooden deck boards directly behind me immediately interrupts my silent reflection. I turn my head slowly, looking past the bright glow of the fire pit. The young, quiet boy from this morning stands a few feet away in the shadows. He is wearing a set of oversized, donated pajamas, clutching the small wooden sailboat tightly in his left hand. He steps forward cautiously into the warm light of the flames. He does not speak a single word. He simply extends his right hand and pushes a folded, slightly crumpled piece of drawing paper toward my chest. I reach out and take the paper gently from his small fingers. I unfold the sheet under the flickering firelight. It is a crude, brightly colored crayon drawing. The image depicts a tall, broad-shouldered man standing firmly like an impenetrable wall, wrapping his large arms like a massive shield around a group of small, smiling children. I look down at the drawing and then back up at the boy. He offers a shy, genuine smile, finally safe in his new home. The morning sun breaks brilliantly over the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, casting an immaculate golden light across the churning salt water. The freezing, hostile coastal winds of the past few months have finally surrendered to a warm, gentle Sunday breeze. I stand alone on the expansive master balcony of the Martha's Vineyard estate, feeling the solid, weather-treated cedar railing beneath my rough hands. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar grounds below me look entirely different than they did when this property was merely a staging ground for fraud, vanity, and deception. The heavy construction machinery is completely gone. The massive steel dumpsters filled to the brim with shattered marble and torn mahogany have been hauled away by the county. In their place lies a perfectly restored, vibrant sanctuary. The dedicated landscaping team worked tirelessly through the week to excavate the barren dirt patch near the eastern property line. They methodically replanted Cora's vintage yellow roses exactly as she had laid them out 30 years ago. The vibrant green leaves and bright yellow petals practically glow in the morning sunlight, breathing genuine life back into the rich coastal soil. The sharp, sweet scent of the blooming flowers drifts up to the second floor, mingling perfectly with the clean, salty ocean air. I hold a heavy ceramic mug in my right hand, feeling the intense heat of the strong black coffee seep into my calloused skin. I look out over the manicured lawn, stretching toward the sandy dunes, taking a slow, steady sip from the rim. The bitter taste grounds me in the absolute reality of this new morning. The chaotic noise of federal trials, frantic holding cell negotiations, and desperate lies has been permanently muted. The estate is completely still, basking in a profound, hard-earned peace. The silent readjustment of my entire existence is completely and irrevocably finished. I lean heavily against the cedar railing, tracing the thick rim of my coffee mug as I process the sheer magnitude of the past year. I lost my only biological daughter. The realization settles into my chest without the paralyzing, suffocating grief that once controlled my every waking moment. Kendra willingly chose her destructive path. She explicitly decided that a fake aristocratic pedigree and imported silk dresses were inherently more valuable than the father who broke his back to keep her safe. She eagerly allied herself with a ruthless parasite, participating in a calculated plot to drain my life savings and cast me aside as a humiliating relic of her working-class past. I did not destroy her life. I simply stopped providing the endless financial and emotional subsidies that shielded her from reality. I stepped entirely out of the way and allowed the brutal mechanics of the real world to deliver the exact consequences she relentlessly demanded. Kendra is currently waking up to another grueling, heavily monitored shift to pay back her insurmountable federal restitution. Blake is currently staring at the concrete walls of a federal penitentiary cell. The overwhelming threat they pose to my survival has been systematically eradicated. In the process of losing a greedy, irredeemable daughter, I managed to permanently reclaim my own dignity. For 3 decades, I operated as a silent, disposable workhorse, blindly handing over my physical health and financial security to feed an insatiable void. Today, my calloused hands serve a fundamentally different purpose. I am no longer a foolish bank account to be manipulated. I am a fierce, unyielding protector to dozens of foster children who actually need a secure foundation. The $3.6 million estate was never truly lost to the syndicate. It was strategically weaponized to expose a massive criminal fraud, bankrupt a con artist, and completely neutralize a toxic family dynamic. Once it served its tactical purpose as a lethal trap for the arrogant and the greedy, it was legally and permanently transferred to the pure of heart. I looked down at the massive dormitory wings we constructed out of Blake's pretentious cigar lounges. The walls are no longer lined with dark imported wood meant to impress phantom investors. They are painted in bright, welcoming colors designed to provide absolute comfort and safety for children who have known nothing but instability. The heavy iron gates at the front of the long gravel driveway no longer keep the world out. They securely protect the vulnerable lives growing inside. I successfully turned a monument of catastrophic vanity into a permanent fortress of hope. The violent underground creditors, the aggressive federal agents, and the vapid elite socialites are all entirely gone. Only the hard truth remains standing on this coastline. I took the very asset my daughter tried to steal and transformed it into a legacy she could never possibly comprehend. I did not just survive their coordinated attack on my livelihood. I completely rewrote the rules of the engagement, ensuring that the wealth generated by decades of my grueling labor would never again be used to fund deception. The scales of justice have been perfectly balanced. The ledger is entirely clear. I take another long sip of coffee, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction resonate through my bones. Cora always told me that every single action eventually returns to its maker multiplied by the exact intention behind it. She believed firmly that you could not build a lasting empire on a foundation of lies, just as you could not break a man who knows the true value of honest labor. Greed ultimately paid its absolute catastrophic price, consuming the very people who tried to violently harness it for their own gain. Grace, however, brought ultimate rebirth. By letting go of the toxic obligation to save those who wished to drown, I cleared the path to rescue those who desperately wanted to swim. A sudden, vibrant burst of noise breaks my solitary reflection. I look down toward the edge of the sprawling green lawn. The heavy wooden doors of the back patio swing wide open. A massive group of foster children spills out into the bright morning light, their energetic, unfiltered laughter drifting up to the balcony. They sprint toward the sandy dunes, chasing each other with pure, unrestricted joy. The young, quiet boy in the faded denim jacket runs near the very front of the pack. He holds his carved wooden sailboat high above his head as he races toward the crashing ocean waves. I watch his bright, genuine smile illuminate the morning. I smile back, taking a final slow sip of my hot coffee. The coastal air filling my lungs is completely clean. The massive cedar foundation supporting this house is absolutely solid. The dark, suffocating chapter of betrayal is entirely closed, locked away in federal records and cold interrogation rooms. I turn away from the railing and walk back inside the warm, sunlit house. My real life has just begun. True family is never solely defined by shared bloodlines or toxic obligations. It is built entirely upon a foundation of mutual respect, unyielding loyalty, and genuine gratitude. You cannot rescue someone who willingly chooses to drown in their own greed, and sacrificing your dignity to fund their delusions will only destroy your peace. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate step to protect yourself. If you found value in this story of reclaiming dignity and demanding respect, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment below, and share this video with your close friends.